Hey there. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is where you're listening from. Maybe it's late night in the States, early morning in England, or a quiet afternoon somewhere else. I'm glad you're here. If you enjoy slow history, you know the routine. Tap like, subscribe if this kind of calm storytelling helps you unwind, and leave a comment telling me which country you're listening from. I really do read them, and they quietly shape what comes next. Now settle in. Lower the volume just enough that you have to lean in. Let the world slow down. Because long before modern democracies, before parliaments and constitutions, before kings began to fear the will of ordinary people, there existed a floating experiment in equality. It drifted across the Atlantic and the Caribbean, carried by salt wind and gun smoke. Hidden beneath black flags and terrible reputations. Most history books rush past it or reduce it to rumor. But it was real. And it terrified empires. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the world's oceans were ruled by kings who never set foot on a deck. Spain, England, France, and the Dutch Republic fought over trade routes and colonies, shipping gold, sugar, tobacco, and enslaved human beings across vast distances. Below deck, sailors lived brutal lives. Pay was low or withheld entirely. Food rotted. Disease spread quickly. Discipline was enforced with the lash. Captains ruled like absolute monarchs, backed by law, church, and crown. A sailor signed on knowing he had almost no rights. If a captain beat him, cheated him, or abandoned him in a foreign port, there was no appeal. Desertion was punished by death. Mutiny by torture and hanging. The ship was a small kingdom, and the captain was its king. It was from this pressure, this constant cruelty, that pirate democracy was born. Piracy did not begin as chaos. It began as refusal. Men who had served on merchant ships or naval vessels reached a breaking point. Some were pressed into service by force. Others were prisoners of war. Many were simply poor, trapped in a system that treated them as expendable cargo. When opportunity appeared, a careless captain, a weak guard, a storm that scattered authority, control of a ship could change hands in a single night. But what happened next is what made pirates different. Instead of replacing one tyrant with another, pirate crews often gathered on deck and voted. They elected their captain. They wrote articles, formal agreements, that defined rights, duties, and punishments. These documents were not symbolic. They were enforced. The captain's power was limited. In battle, he commanded absolutely because chaos meant death. But outside combat, authority belonged to the crew as a whole. Disputes were settled by vote. Loot was divided according to agreed shares. Injury compensation was standardized. Lose a leg, receive a set amount of silver. Lose an eye, another amount. In a world with no insurance and no welfare, this was radical. Even more unsettling to the empires was who could participate. Pirate crews were often multinational. English, Irish, Welsh, Scottish, French, Dutch, African, indigenous Caribbean men, sometimes even former slaves, work side by side. On land, these men were separated by law, language, and prejudice. At sea, under the black flag, they were equals in profit and risk. This was not idealism. It was practical survival. Pirate ship depended on trust. Every man needed to know he would not be cheated. The articles made betrayal costly and fairness profitable. Equality was not preached. It was enforced because it worked. Kings understood this danger immediately. If common sailors discovered they could govern themselves, if they could vote, share wealth, and remove leaders who abused power, what would stop those ideas from spreading back to ports, dockyards, and cities? What would happen if the lower decks began to question the upper ones? This fear shaped the response to piracy. Captured pirates were not treated as ordinary criminals. They were paraded, chained, displayed in iron cages at harbor mouths as warnings. Their bodies were left to rot in the tide. Pamphlets painted them as monsters, drunkards, and demons, anything but organized political actors. Yet quietly their way of life spread. Men captured by pirates were often given a choice: join or be set ashore. Many chose to join. Not because piracy was safe, it wasn't, but because it was fair in a way the lawful world was not. For the first time, a sailor might speak openly to a captain without fear. For the first time, his labor had a defined value. Even women, rare as they were, found space within this world. Figures like Bonny and Mary Read did not merely disguise themselves. They fought, voted, and claimed shares like any other crew member. Their presence shocked European sensibilities, further feeding the myth that pirates were unnatural, dangerous, and corrupting. But the truth was simpler. Pirate democracy was a response to unchecked power. It did not seek to overthrow kings directly. It did not write manifestos for land-based revolution. It existed in the margins, between ports, beyond the reach of law. And that made it both fragile and powerful. For a brief window, roughly from 1690 to 1730, this floating brotherhood flourished. Nassau in the Bahamas became an unofficial pirate republic. There, captains anchored side by side. Decisions were debated openly. Stolen goods were traded. News traveled fast. Ideas moved faster. Empires could not tolerate this. Navies were strengthened. Pardons were offered to divide crews. Informants were paid. One by one, famous captains were hunted down. Blackbeard was killed in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. Charles Vane was hanged. Calico Jack followed. The Brotherhood fractured under pressure it could not withstand forever. Yet, even as the last pirate bodies swung from gibbets, their ideas did not die. They had proven something dangerous. That ordinary men, written off as criminals and laborers, could organize themselves. That authority could be conditional. That leadership could be earned, not inherited. That fairness could exist even in violent places. And once an idea like that exists, it never fully disappears. The sea grew quieter. Flags were lowered. Trade resumed under the watchful eyes of kings. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The waves remembered. The everyday reality of pirate democracy did not feel grand or philosophical to the men who lived it. Felt practical. Felt necessary. On a rolling deck, with wind cutting across the skin and salt drying on clothes, ideas only survived if they worked. Anything else was thrown overboard. When a ship first fell into pirate hands, the most important moment came after the fighting stopped. Weapons were lowered. Blood was washed from the planks with seawater. Then the crew gathered, often near the mainmast, where everyone could see and be seen. This was not ceremony for show. It was the foundation of order. The articles were read aloud. Some crews carried written copies. Others relied on memory, passed down from ship to ship, adjusted slightly each time. The language was simple and direct. No long legal phrases. No Latin. Just rules that could be understood by men who might not read at all. Every man had a vote in matters of importance. Every man had an equal claim to food and drink. Gambling disputes were forbidden, because they bred resentment. Lights were to be extinguished at a set hour, to prevent accidents and conserve supplies. Weapons were to be kept clean and ready, because neglect endangered everyone. Punishments existed, but they were defined. A man who stole from another crew member might be marooned. A man who deserted during battle might be executed. These penalties were harsh, but they were known in advance, and they were decided collectively. This alone separated pirate ships from naval vessels, where discipline was arbitrary and often cruel. Perhaps the most striking rule concerned leadership. The captain was elected, not appointed by a distant admiral, not born into the role. Elected by men who would fight and die under his command. If he was brave, decisive, and fair, he remained captain. If he became cowardly, abusive, or unlucky, he could be removed. Sometimes this happened quietly. Sometimes it happened with raised voices and drawn pistols. But it happened. Alongside the captain stood another powerful figure, the quartermaster. In many ways, the quartermaster mattered more. He represented the crew's interests. He distributed loot. He settled minor disputes. He could challenge the captain openly. On some ships, The quartermaster controlled discipline entirely, ensuring the captain could not become a tyrant. Power was divided by design. This balance shocked contemporary observers. Merchants and governors could not understand how such violent men tolerated limits on authority. They assumed pirates must be lying or exaggerating, or masking chaos with talk of order. But records tell a different story. Captured pirates, when questioned separately, often described similar systems. Court transcripts from England, Jamaica, and the American colonies reveal consistent patterns. Even under threat of execution, pirates spoke of votes, shares, and agreed rules. These were not stories invented afterward. They were habits learned through experience. The division of plunder followed the same logic. On a merchant ship, wages were fixed, but theft was common. Captains skimmed profits. Owners cheated crews. On a pirate ship, shares were transparent. A captain might receive 2 shares. A quartermaster 1.5. Ordinary crewmen 1 share each. Specialists, gunners, carpenters, surgeons, sometimes received extra compensation. The exact numbers varied, but the principle remained. Everyone knew what he would receive before the treasure was taken. This clarity reduced conflict. It also reduced fear. Injury, one of the greatest terrors of sea life, was addressed directly. Pirate articles often listed payments for wounds. Lose a right arm, receive 600 pieces of 8. Lose a leg, 500. Lesser injuries received lesser sums. These numbers mattered. They meant a man could survive after piracy ended, or at least survive longer. In the lawful world, an injured sailor was discarded. Here he was compensated. This did not make pirate life gentle. Disease still spread. Storms still killed. Battles were sudden and brutal. But within that danger existed a sense of mutual obligation rarely found elsewhere. Race complicates this picture, but it does not erase it. European societies of the time were rigidly hierarchical and deeply racist. Slavery underpinned Atlantic wealth. African men were chained in holds, sold in ports, worked to death on plantations. Pirates operated within this same world, and they did not escape its contradictions. Yet aboard pirate ships the lines blurred. Escaped slaves joined crews. Free black sailors served as gunners, navigators, and fighters. Some pirate articles made no distinction between races at all. Shares were distributed equally. Votes counted the same. This was not abolitionism in a modern sense, but it was a direct challenge to the racial order of empire. Authorities noticed. When pirates were captured, black crew members were often treated differently. Some were re-enslaved rather than executed. Others were sold. The fear was not just piracy. It was the image of racial equality at sea, a vision that threatened plantation economies. Language, too, became flexible. A pirate ship was a place of translation and improvisation. Commands were shouted in mixed tongues. Gestures filled gaps. Music crossed borders. Sea shanties evolved, carrying fragments of many cultures. The ocean became a shared space where nationality mattered less than skill and loyalty. This is why the Brotherhood spread so quickly. A sailor beaten in an English port heard rumors from a Frenchman who had sailed with Dutch pirates. A captive merchant seaman, released in Cuba, carried stories to Jamaica. These stories were exaggerated, yes, but at their core was a simple message. Out here things are different. Governors tried to crush these stories. They issued proclamations. They offered pardons. They warned that pirates betrayed each other, that their democracy was false. Sometimes they were right. Pirates argued. They fought. They killed among themselves. But sailors listened to actions more than words. When a man who had been a nobody on a merchant ship suddenly returned to port with gold in his pockets, scars on his arms, and a voice that carried confidence, his presence spoke louder than any proclamation. The Brotherhood did not promise safety, promised dignity, and for many that was enough to risk everything. As the years passed, pirate democracy became more refined, not less. Crews learned from mistakes. Articles grew more detailed. Leaders adapted. Nassau briefly became a hub where these ideas met, clashed, and evolved. But with every improvement came increased attention. Empires were patient. They watched, they learned, and they prepared to respond. By the time pirate democracy reached its height, the Atlantic world was already changing in ways most sailors could sense but not name. Trade was accelerating. Empires were becoming more organized, more bureaucratic, more efficient at violence. The same forces that had created opportunities for piracy were now sharpening the tools that would eventually destroy it. But for a while, the balance still favored the Brotherhood. Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, was not impressive by European standards. Its harbor was shallow, its defenses weak, its buildings crude. Yet its location was perfect. It sat near major shipping lanes, close to Spanish treasure routes, and far enough from strong colonial governments to remain difficult to control. After the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, thousands of sailors were suddenly unemployed. Naval budgets were cut. Privateers, men legally allowed to raid enemy ships during wartime, lost their commissions overnight. Many had spent years fighting, taking prizes, and living by a rough code that already resembled piracy. They did not return quietly to poverty. Ships that had once sailed under royal letters of marque simply stopped recognizing peace. Crews kept their weapons. Captains kept their habits. And Nassau became a gathering point for men who no longer fit into lawful society. Here, pirate democracy was not confined to a single deck. Spilled onto land. There was no governor with real authority for years. Taverns became meeting halls. Captains negotiated alliances. Crews voted to combine forces or split apart. Disputes were settled by arbitration or violence, depending on the mood and the stakes. It was chaotic, but it was not random. Benjamin Hornigold emerged as one of the early leaders of this loose republic. He was experienced, respected, and strategic. Unlike some later figures, he avoided attacking English ships, focusing instead on Spanish and French targets. His restraint earned him followers and kept internal conflict low. Among those who sailed with Hornigold was a man who would become a symbol larger than life. Edward Teach, later known as Blackbeard. Teach understood power, but he also understood performance. His fearsome appearance, long beard tied with ribbons, slow-burning fuses woven into his hair during battle, was designed to intimidate without unnecessary bloodshed. Terror, when used correctly, reduced resistance and casualties on both sides. Yet even Blackbeard ruled within limits. His crew had elected him. His authority depended on continued success. When he took prizes, loot was shared according to agreed terms. When he made decisions, he consulted his officers. The image of Blackbeard as a mad tyrant served later propaganda well, but it does not align with how pirate leadership actually functioned. In Nassau, men like Blackbeard, Hornigold, Charles Vane, and Jack Rackham coexisted uneasily. Their crews mingled. Their rules overlapped. Arguments flared, sometimes violently. Pirate democracy did not eliminate conflict. It provided a framework to survive it. This uneasy order alarmed colonial officials. Merchants complained of losses. Insurance rates rose. Governors wrote desperate letters to London. The British Crown, already wary of rebellion after years of war and internal unrest, could not ignore a self-governing outlaw society forming in its colonial backyard. The response came in two forms: mercy and force. In 1718, King George I issued a general pardon to pirates who surrendered within a set time. The message was carefully crafted: return to lawful society, and your crimes will be forgiven. Continue and face destruction. Some accepted. Hornigold took the pardon and became a pirate hunter, a move that fractured the Brotherhood and deepened mistrust. Others, like Vane, refused outright, firing on royal ships and declaring that no king had authority over them. This division weakened pirate unity more than any canon. Those who accepted the pardon often struggled to reintegrate. They were distrusted, watched, sometimes cheated of promised protection. Those who refused became targets of concentrated naval campaigns. Woodes Rogers, a former privateer himself, was appointed governor of the Bahamas with a clear mandate: restore order. He arrived with warships, soldiers, and legal authority. Nassau was no longer neglected. Rogers understood pirate democracy well enough to exploit it. He spread rumors. He encouraged defections. He played rival captains against one another. He offered pardons selectively, creating resentment among those left out. Where violence alone might have failed, division succeeded. Still, pirate ships continued to sail. Away from Nassau, the Brotherhood survived in fragments. Crews adapted, becoming more mobile, less dependent on any single port. Pirate articles remained central, even as circumstances grew harsher. In a world increasingly hostile, internal trust mattered more than ever. This period also revealed the limits of pirate democracy. Equality did not erase ambition. Some captains pushed boundaries, taking larger shares or making unilateral decisions. Crews responded in different ways. Some mutinied. Others tolerated abuses in exchange for success. Democracy was not guaranteed. It had to be defended constantly. And then there was violence. Pirate raids were terrifying for victims. Ships were seized. Cargo was stolen. Sometimes crews were abused or killed. No matter how fair pirates were among themselves, they inflicted fear and loss on others. This contradiction haunted the Brotherhood and shaped how history would judge it. Empires seized on this. Pamphlets described pirates as devils in human form. Ballads exaggerated their cruelty. Trials were public spectacles. The message was clear. Whatever pirates claimed about fairness or freedom, they were enemies of order and civilization. Yet sailors kept listening to quieter truths. They knew what life was like under a brutal captain. They knew what it meant to be unpaid, unprotected, unseen. When pirates spoke of shared risk and shared reward, it resonated. The ocean remained a place where authority could still be challenged. But the challenge was becoming harder. Naval patrols increased. Intelligence networks improved. Pirate havens disappeared. The Brotherhood was being pushed into narrower spaces, forced to take greater risks for smaller rewards. And with pressure came mistakes. The next years would see dramatic captures, betrayals, and deaths, events that would end the golden age of pirate democracy, but also reveal just how deeply its principles had taken root. The experiment was running out of time. The question was not whether it would end. It was what would survive when it did. As pressure closed in on pirate crews across the Atlantic, life aboard their ships grew more intense, more disciplined, and in some ways more fragile. The world that had briefly allowed pirate democracy to flourish was shrinking. Safe harbors disappeared. Familiar faces vanished from taverns. News arrived more often carrying warnings instead of opportunity. Yet the rules remained. Even as danger increased, pirates clung more tightly to their articles. When everything else became uncertain, agreed law was the one anchor they still trusted. A man might die tomorrow, but tonight he would receive his fair share. Tonight, his voice would still count. This was not sentimentality. It was survival. Out on open water, pirate crews faced a paradox. To avoid capture, they needed speed and secrecy. To maintain democracy, they needed discussion and consent. Decisions that once could be debated slowly now had to be made quickly, sometimes under fire. This tested the limits of collective rule. Captains adapted. Some, like Bartholomew Roberts, known later as Black Bart, refined pirate governance into something remarkably structured. Roberts was not charismatic in the theatrical sense. He did not cultivate fear like Blackbeard. Instead, he cultivated efficiency. Under his command, articles were strict. Drunkenness was punished. Lights-out rules were enforced. Gambling remained banned. Roberts believed discipline protected freedom. His crews elected him repeatedly, even after defeats, because he delivered results. He took hundreds of ships, amassed immense wealth, and ran his floating communities with an iron hand tempered by clear law. His authority was strong, but it was always grounded in consent. If he overstepped, he knew removal was possible. This balance made him dangerous to empires. Robert's career revealed something uncomfortable for royal authorities. Pirate democracy did not mean disorder. In some cases, it produced ships more effective than their lawful counterparts. Crews fought harder when they believed in their leadership. They endured hardship more willingly when they trusted distribution would be fair. Naval officers noticed. Reports sent back to London and Paris describe pirates fighting with discipline, maintaining formations, and coordinating attacks. This contradicted popular images of drunken chaos. It suggested that pirates had learned lessons that professional navies themselves were still struggling to implement. The response was escalation. Warships grew larger and faster. Patrol routes became systematic. Rewards for pirate heads increased. Governors were given broader powers to prosecute without lengthy trials. The legal net tightened. Within pirate crews, fear crept in quietly. Not fear of death, that had always been present, but fear of betrayal. As pardons multiplied and informants were paid, trust eroded. Articles tried to address this. Spying, desertion, and secrecy violations carried severe penalties. Some crews required oaths sworn on weapons or sacred texts, binding men psychologically as well as socially. Even so, cracks appeared. A captured crewman might face torture or execution. Talk. Others lied. Rumors spread faster than facts. A whispered accusation could turn friends into enemies. Pirate democracy, built on trust, struggled when trust became scarce. Race, once relatively fluid, became more complicated under stress. In calmer times, equality was practical. Under pursuit, hierarchies sometimes hardened. Some white crew members feared harsher punishment if associated too closely with black pirates. Authorities exploited this fear, offering leniency selectively. The Brotherhood did not collapse along racial lines, but tensions increased. Women aboard pirate ships faced even greater scrutiny. And Bonny and Mary Red sailed with Calico Jack Rackham during this later, more desperate period. Their presence challenged norms not only of gender but of vulnerability. When Rackham's crew was captured, many of the men were drunk or hiding below deck. Bonny and Reed fought on. Later accounts exaggerated their ferocity, but court records confirm their resistance. Their story reveals both the possibilities and limits of pirate democracy. They were accepted as fighters and crew members. Their voices mattered, but their fate ultimately depended on biological circumstance. Both avoided immediate execution because they were pregnant. The law that spared them had nothing to do with pirate equality. It belonged to the same legal system that destroyed the Brotherhood. The sea did not care about fairness. Storms struck without warning. Ships were lost without trace. Disease swept through cramped quarters. Pirate democracy could not vote away dysentery or hurricanes. Every loss strained morale. Every failure made the lawful world seem, briefly, more tempting. Some crews accepted pardons late, hoping to salvage what they could. Others refused to the end, convinced that submission meant slow death anyway. The final years of the Golden Age were marked by intensity rather than expansion. Pirates took bigger risks for smaller rewards. They attacked better-armed ships. They sailed farther, into colder waters off Africa and Brazil. Each voyage felt like a gamble against time itself. Through it all, the articles endured. When a pirate ship was finally captured, officials often confiscated these documents. Some were preserved. Others were destroyed. But enough survived for historians to reconstruct their content. They reveal men grappling seriously with governance, fairness, and authority under extreme conditions. Not philosophers. Not revolutionaries. Working sailors solving problems the only way they knew how. This is why pirate democracy unsettled kings. It did not emerge from universities or salons. It emerged from suffering. It required no theory to justify itself. Its logic was obvious to anyone who lived under arbitrary power. As executions multiplied and famous captains fell, the Brotherhood began to sense its own mortality. Songs changed tone. Jokes grew darker. Crews spoke more often of final battles rather than future plans. The ocean, once a place of possibility, felt narrower now. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the forces of empire waited patiently, confident that time was on their side. They were right. But they underestimated what would remain after the ships were gone. As the noose tightened around the pirate world, the experience of democracy aboard ship changed in subtle but important ways. What had once felt like freedom now carried weight. Every vote mattered more, because every decision carried the risk of death. The sea did not forgive hesitation, and neither did the gallows waiting in colonial ports. Yet even in this narrowing world, pirate crews continued to meet, argue, and decide together. When a lookout spotted a sail on the horizon, the question was no longer just whether to attack. It was whether the prize was worth the risk. Merchant ships increasingly sailed in convoys. Some carried hidden guns. Others were decoys designed to lure pirates into traps. Captains no longer made these choices alone. Crews gathered, voices low, eyes scanning the sky, and voted. To an outsider this might seem foolish. Why pause for discussion when speed was essential? But pirates understood something naval commanders often ignored. Men fight harder for plans they helped choose. If the crew voted to attack and failed, responsibility was shared. There was less room for resentment, less temptation to blame a single leader. This shared responsibility held crews together longer than fear ever could. Still, fear crept in through other doors. The public executions of pirates were meant to break morale. In ports like London, Boston, and Charleston, crowds gathered to watch former captains and quartermasters hang. Newspapers printed names, last words, and confessions. Authorities wanted sailors everywhere to imagine themselves in that position. Pirates heard these stories at sea. They spoke of friends who had laughed on deck weeks earlier and now swung in chains beside the water. These conversations often happened at night, when the wind dropped and the creaking of wood sounded louder than usual. Democracy did not silence dread. It gave it a place to be spoken. Some crews voted to become more ruthless, believing terror might discourage resistance and shorten battles. Others voted the opposite, hoping mercy would reduce the desire for revenge. There was no single pirate policy. Each ship became its own small experiment, adapting to pressure in real time. Bartholomew Roberts' articles reflect this moment clearly. They emphasize order, sobriety, and preparedness. There is little romance in them. They read like survival manuals. Roberts understood that indulgence weakened democracy. A drunk man could not vote wisely. A careless man endangered everyone. His approach worked, but it came at a cost. Discipline sometimes felt closer to naval life than pirates liked to admit. Some crew members left. Others stayed, convinced that strict rules were the only way to preserve equality. Freedom, they learned, was not the absence of rules. It was the right to shape them. Elsewhere, leadership broke down. Charles Vane, once defiant and respected, increasingly made decisions without consent. He refused prizes others wanted. He retreated from battles his crews believed they could win. Eventually, his men voted to remove him as captain. The process was swift. One day he commanded. The next, he was cast adrift with a few loyal followers. This moment mattered. It showed that pirate democracy was not symbolic. Even famous captains were subject to it. But it also revealed its limits. Vane did not disappear quietly. He returned to piracy later, more desperate, more violent, less constrained by shared rules. When he was finally captured and executed, authorities pointed to his excesses as proof that pirates could not govern themselves. They did not mention that his downfall came through democratic means. The story of women in piracy also took on darker tones during this period. And Bonny and Mary Red, already infamous, became symbols in pamphlets that exaggerated their cruelty to shock readers. The reality was more complex. They had fought, voted, and lived within the same rules as others. But as danger increased, tolerance narrowed. Crews became less willing to challenge norms that might attract additional attention. Pirate democracy had space for difference when it was strong. Under siege, it became cautious. Race followed a similar pattern. In earlier years, black pirates like Black Caesar sailed with relative equality. Under heightened repression, racial solidarity sometimes fractured. Authorities exploited fears, promising different outcomes based on skin color or origin. Some pirate crews resisted this manipulation. Others fell apart. These moments are uncomfortable to acknowledge, but they matter. Pirate democracy was not pure. It was human. It reflected the pressures and prejudices of its time, even as it challenged them. Despite this, the Brotherhood's core principles endured longer than many expected. When pirate ships were captured, officials were often surprised by how calm crews appeared. Men stood together. They did not immediately turn on one another. Some refused to testify against their shipmates, even when offered reduced sentences. Loyalty, forged through shared rule, proved stubborn. Trial records show pirates speaking openly about their articles, even when doing so did not help them. They described votes, shares, and rules as if explaining something obvious. They seemed confused that judges found these ideas threatening. To the state, these testimonies were dangerous. They revealed an alternative order, one that functioned without kings, nobles, or priests. It did not claim divine authority, claimed consent. For governments built on hierarchy, this was intolerable. The campaign against pirates intensified further. Naval patrols coordinated across empires. Information flowed faster. Pirate flags became rarer sights. Ships that once slipped easily through gaps were now intercepted. Each loss made the next voyage more desperate. By the early 1720s, many sailors understood that the Golden Age was ending. The Brotherhood still existed, but it was living on borrowed time. And yet, even now, men continued to choose it. They chose it knowing the odds. They chose it knowing the likely end. They chose it because, for however long it lasted, pirate democracy gave them something the lawful world rarely did. Voice, share, a say in how they lived and died. As the horizon darkened and the sea grew more dangerous, that mattered more than ever. By the early 1720s, the ocean no longer felt like a wide-open refuge. Felt watched. Every sail on the horizon carried uncertainty. Every unfamiliar port carried risk. Pirate democracy still existed, but it now lived under constant pressure, like a flame cupped in rough hands. Crews noticed the change first in small ways. Water supplies became harder to replenish. Friendly merchants disappeared. Taverns that once welcomed pirates now shut their doors or whispered to governors. Information once abundant turned unreliable. A rumor of a weakly guarded route might be a trap. A familiar anchorage might hide a waiting warship. In this climate, meetings on deck grew quieter and more serious. Votes were no longer casual. Arguments carried sharper edges. A single decision could doom everyone. Pirate democracy did not slow down. It intensified. Men listened more closely. They questioned more deeply. The Brotherhood had less room for mistakes. When a pirate ship encountered a naval vessel, the contrast was stark. On the warship, orders flowed downward, rigid and unquestioned. Sailors obeyed out of fear of punishment. On the pirate ship, orders still flowed, but they were backed by shared agreement. Men knew why they fought. They had chosen this course together. Sometimes, this difference still gave pirates an advantage. There are recorded encounters where pirates outmaneuvered better-armed ships through coordination and morale. Crews worked as one, anticipating each other's movements. Trust, built over time through fair treatment, paid dividends in moments of chaos. But numbers and technology began to matter more. Naval ships grew heavier. Cannons reached farther. Trained marines boarded with precision. Pirate ships, often lighter and faster, could still escape, but only if luck favored them. Luck, however, does not last forever. The capture of pirates increasingly followed a familiar pattern. 8. A brief violent fight. 8. Then transport to the nearest major port. From there the process moved quickly. Trials were swift. Evidence was often thin. Articles of piracy were presented as proof of criminal conspiracy rather than governance. Votes were reinterpreted as plots. Equality became collective guilt. Pirates watched this from afar and adjusted their internal rules accordingly. Some crews destroyed their articles before battle, hoping to avoid harsher punishment if captured. Others kept them, refusing to deny what they had lived by. This choice alone reveals much about pirate democracy. For some, survival came first. For others, integrity did. The Brotherhood was never unified on this question. That, too, was democratic reality. As executions mounted, certain figures became cautionary tales whispered across decks. The death of Blackbeard in 1718 sent shockwaves. His body, reportedly riddled with wounds, was displayed as a warning. Authorities wanted pirates to imagine invincibility dying in blood and mud. Pirates did imagine it. They spoke of the fight in hushed tones. Some mocked the spectacle. Others fell silent. Blackbeard's death marked more than the loss of a captain. It marked the end of an era where intimidation alone could protect them. After that, strategy replaced theater. Crews debated targets more carefully. They avoided heavily defended routes. They sailed farther from colonial centers. Pirate democracy became less visible, less bold, but more deliberate. In Africa, on the so-called pirate round, crews found temporary relief. European authority was weaker there. Trade routes were long and vulnerable. For a time, pirate ships thrived again. Articles were rewritten to reflect new conditions. Leadership shifted. The Brotherhood adapted. But even here the world was closing in. European companies expanded their reach. Forts were built. Local rulers, pressured or bribed, turned against pirates. What had once been a distant frontier became another monitored space. The emotional toll of this constant flight cannot be overstated. Living under pirate democracy required participation, attention, and courage. Men could not retreat into obedience. They had to engage, to argue, to decide. Under stress, this became exhausting. Some longed for simpler authority, even if it was harsh. This is one of the quiet truths of the Brotherhood. Freedom requires effort. There are accounts of pirates voting to disband peacefully when prospects dimmed. Crews divided remaining wealth. Ships were sold or scuttled. Men went their separate ways, hoping to disappear into port cities under false names. Others refused to surrender the experiment. They believed that as long as one ship sailed under shared rules, the Brotherhood lived. For them, pirate democracy was not just a method, it was an identity. Captured pirates sometimes expressed this sentiment openly. In court, when asked why they turned to piracy, some answered simply that they wanted to be free from abuse, that they wanted a fair share, that they wanted a say. Judges dismissed these explanations as excuses, but they were consistent, repeated across cases, across oceans. This consistency terrified authorities more than any single raid. It suggested that piracy was not merely criminal, it was symptomatic. It emerged wherever power went unchecked. By the mid-1720s, the number of pirate ships had dropped sharply. The Brotherhood was thinning. Each remaining crew carried more weight, more memory, more defiance. They knew what was coming. Meetings on deck sometimes ended not with laughter, but with long silences. Men stared at the horizon, thinking of past voyages, fallen friends, and the narrowing future. Votes were taken slowly. Hands were raised carefully. Even now, no one forced another to stay. That choice, the right to leave, remained sacred to the end. And in that quiet respect for consent, pirate democracy revealed its final strength. Did not promise victory, promised agency. As the waves rolled on and the wind carried them forward, the Brotherhood sailed into history, aware that it was being outpaced by empires, but unwilling to surrender its core. Not yet. By the time the last strong pirate crews still roamed the seas, Everyone involved understood the unspoken truth. This was no longer an age of expansion, but of endurance. Pirate democracy was no longer growing. It was holding on. The ships that remained were often older, patched again and again, their sails repaired with whatever cloth could be found. These vessels carried not just men and weapons, but memory. Each plank seemed to hold the echo of earlier days, when the horizon felt wider and choices felt lighter. On these ships, meetings still happened. Sometimes they took place at dawn, when the sea was calm and the air cool. Sometimes late at night, lanterns swinging gently, faces half-lit, voices low. The process had become ritualized, almost sacred. Man spoke. Another responded. Others nodded or shook their heads. Then came the vote. Not every decision was heroic. Many were small. Whether to risk stopping at a certain island for water, whether to keep sailing despite exhaustion, whether to accept a new recruit whose story could not be verified. But even these small choices carried weight now. Trust had become precious. New men were scrutinized carefully. Questions were asked. Past voyages discussed. Crews wanted skill, but they wanted loyalty more. A single informer could doom everyone. Pirate democracy depended on openness, yet survival demanded caution. Balancing the two became one of the Brotherhood's hardest challenges. Some crews introduced probationary periods. A new man might work without full voting rights for a time. This was not common in earlier years, and it caused debate. Was it a betrayal of equality, or a necessary adaptation? There was no universal answer. Each ship decided for itself. That too was democracy. Captured sailors who joined pirates during this period often did so with clear eyes. They had heard the stories. They knew the risks. When given the choice, some still chose to join. Not because they believed in victory, but because they believed in dignity. One former merchant sailor later testified that he joined pirates because, among them, a man was not nothing. That phrase appears in different forms across several trial records. It suggests a deep hunger not just for wealth, but for recognition. On lawful ships, a sailor was replaceable. On a pirate ship he was counted. As pirate numbers dwindled, naval pressure intensified further. Patrols began to anticipate pirate movements rather than simply respond to attacks. Intelligence networks improved. Former pirates turned informants, sometimes willingly, sometimes under threat. Maps were updated. Routes were closed. When pirate ships were cornered, the resulting battles were often desperate and brief. Crews knew surrender meant hanging. There was no illusion left about mercy. Some chose to fight to the end. Others attempted escape until masts shattered or hulls flooded. Democracy did not vanish in these moments. Crews voted on whether to resist or flee. Even facing overwhelming force, consent mattered. There are accounts of pirate captains asking their men directly whether they wished to engage a pursuing warship. Hands were raised. Decisions were made. The outcome, whatever it was, belonged to everyone. This mattered deeply to those who survived long enough to reflect. In prison cells awaiting trial, pirates often spoke less about gold and more about how decisions had been shared. They remembered arguments on deck. They remembered votes that went against them, and how they accepted the outcome because it had been fair. These memories did not save them. Trials were swift and theatrical. Courts emphasized obedience to crown and law. Pirate articles were mocked as criminal contracts. Judges dismissed the idea that such men could govern themselves. The verdicts were almost always the same: guilty. Executions followed ritual patterns. Pirates were marched through towns, watched by crowds. Ministers urged repentance. Some men prayed. Others remained silent. A few spoke defiantly, declaring that they had lived free, if only briefly. Authorities hoped these displays would erase the appeal of piracy. Instead, they etched it deeper into memory. Sailors who witnessed these events carried the stories with them. They spoke of men who died without kneeling, who faced death having once lived by their own rules. These stories traveled far, passed from mouth to mouth, stripped of official condemnation and filled instead with quiet admiration. Pirate democracy began to exist less as a practice and more as an idea that lingered. By the late 1720s, the Golden Age was effectively over. Pirate ships still appeared occasionally, but they were isolated, hunted, and short-lived. The Brotherhood no longer had centers like Nassau, no longer had numbers. What it had was legacy. The men who survived and returned to shore carried habits with them. Some became fishermen. Some disappeared into port cities. Some joined navies or merchant fleets again. They brought with them expectations shaped by life under shared rule. They questioned captains more openly. They resisted arbitrary punishment. They compared conditions. Sometimes this led to conflict. Sometimes it led to small reforms. Empires did not collapse because of pirates, but they learned from them. Naval discipline slowly shifted. Wages became more standardized. Injury compensation improved. Some of these changes came from economic necessity, others from fear of unrest. Pirate democracy had shown what happened when exploitation went too far. Even those who condemned piracy absorbed its lessons. The Brotherhood itself faded quietly. There was no final meeting, no declaration of defeat. Ships were captured one by one. Crews vanished. The sea reclaimed its anonymity. Yet the ocean remembered. Every time sailors gathered informally to discuss grievances, every time crews demanded fair shares, every time authority was questioned rather than obeyed blindly, a faint echo of pirate democracy surfaced. It was not named, did not need to be. It lived in the understanding that power could be shared, even in the harshest environments, that rules could be made by those who followed them, that leadership could be conditional. As the last pirate ships were broken apart and their flags burned, kings believed the threat had ended. They were wrong. The ships were gone. But the idea had already slipped ashore. After the last pirate strongholds fell silent, the world did not suddenly become orderly. The ships were gone, the black flags burned, but the conditions that had created pirate democracy remained. Sailors were still overworked. Captains still held near total authority. Empires still extracted wealth from the sea without much concern for the men who made that wealth possible. What changed was awareness. Men who had lived under pirate articles carried a different sense of what was possible. Even when they returned to lawful service, they did not entirely forget how it felt to vote, to speak openly, to know the terms of their labor in advance. These memories lingered quietly, shaping expectations in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to erase. In port cities, former pirates blended in easily. Sailors moved constantly. Names changed. Faces weathered. A man who had once voted on a pirate deck might later load cargo in Bristol or Charleston without anyone knowing his past. But his habits traveled with him. He asked questions. He noticed unfairness more quickly. He compared. These small acts mattered. Naval authorities sensed a shift, even if they could not trace it directly to piracy. Mutinies did not disappear after the Golden Age ended. In fact, some grew more organized. Sailors increasingly demanded redress rather than reacting in blind rage. They framed complaints collectively. They removed officers through coordinated action. This was dangerous territory. Governments were careful not to admit any connection to pirate practices, but internal correspondence reveals concern. Officers were warned to maintain discipline without excessive cruelty. Pay delays were addressed more urgently. The goal was not justice, it was stability. Pirate democracy had demonstrated a simple truth. Extreme inequality breeds resistance. The lesson was absorbed unevenly, but it was absorbed. On merchant ships, too, subtle changes appeared. Contracts became more standardized. Terms were written more clearly. While captains still held power, their authority was no longer entirely unquestioned. Sailors knew that alternatives had once existed, and that knowledge alone altered the balance. This is how ideas survive. Not through monuments or official recognition, but through memory and habit. Meanwhile, writers and pamphleteers continued to shape the pirate image for public consumption. Sensational stories emphasized cruelty, madness, and greed. Pirate democracy was rarely mentioned, and when it was framed as hypocrisy. Authorities preferred pirates to appear as monsters, not as men responding rationally to injustice. But beneath this noise, other accounts persisted. Court transcripts preserved pirate voices almost by accident. In attempting to condemn them, the legal system recorded their explanations. These records sat quietly in archives, waiting. When later historians began to read them carefully, a different picture emerged. One of organization, of negotiation, of shared governance. This rediscovery happened slowly, long after the last execution. Pirate democracy did not influence revolutions directly. It did not inspire constitutions in any obvious way. Its impact was diffuse, indirect, and therefore more difficult to dismiss. It showed that democracy could exist outside formal institutions. It showed that people excluded from power could still create systems of accountability. This realization unsettled later scholars as much as it had unsettled kings. Even the language of pirate articles echoes forward in time. Phrases about equal shares, collective decision-making, and elected leadership appear again in later labor movements. Sailors were among the first global workers. They carried ideas across borders long before political theory caught up. The sea, in this sense, was an early laboratory for modern social thought. Pirate democracy was not clean. It was not peaceful. It did not aspire to universal rights. But it was functional. And function matters when conditions are harsh. This is why it continues to fascinate. Not because pirates were heroes, but because they were practical. They did not wait for permission to address injustice. They did not petition distant authorities. They built something workable with the tools they had, in the space they controlled. That space was small. Deck, crew. A set of rules agreed upon aloud. But within that space, hierarchy was limited, power was conditional, and voices mattered. As time passed, the memory of pirate democracy softened. It became romanticized, then mythologized. Black flags turned into costumes. Captains turned into caricatures. The reality faded beneath layers of fiction. Yet the core remained, visible to those who looked closely. Historians eventually began to describe pirates not just as criminals, but as social actors. This shift did not excuse violence, contextualized it. It placed piracy within the larger story of labor, empire, and resistance. In this telling, pirate democracy stands not as an anomaly, but as a response to exploitation, a response to silence, a response to power that refused to listen. And perhaps this is why the story still resonates. Because the conditions that produced it are not entirely gone. People still work under systems they did not choose. They still face authority that feels distant and arbitrary. They still imagine alternative arrangements, often informally, often briefly. Pirate democracy reminds us that even in the most constrained environments, humans look for ways to assert agency. They negotiate, they agree, they vote, they enforce, they remember. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the ocean changed. Steam replaced sail. Empires expanded inland. The age of wooden ships and iron men faded. But the lesson remained. Power is never absolute. And even when crushed, shared governance leaves traces that time cannot fully erase. The Brotherhood had vanished from the waves, but its imprint lingered in the rhythms of work, in the language of fairness, and in the quiet expectation that leadership should answer to those it commands. That expectation did not come from kings, came from sailors, and from a forgotten democracy that once drifted between continents, daring the world to notice. Long after the last pirate trials faded from public memory, the archives remained. Quiet rooms, dusty shelves, bundles of papers tied with string. For generations, these records slept, unnoticed, while history favored kings, admirals, and lawmakers. Pirate democracy did not fit comfortably into heroic national narratives, so it waited. When scholars finally began to read these documents closely, they noticed something unsettling. Pirates spoke like workers. Not like rebels chasing ideology, and not like madmen driven by chaos, but like laborers negotiating terms. Their language was direct, practical, concerned with fairness, injury, discipline, and accountability. These were not abstract concerns. They were daily realities. This realization shifted how piracy could be understood. Instead of asking why pirates rejected law, historians began asking what kind of law they created in its place. And once that question was asked, pirate democracy stopped looking like an accident and started looking like a system. Fragile one. A violent one. But a system nonetheless. What emerged from these studies was a pattern repeated across ships, oceans, and years. Independent crews, isolated from state authority, consistently developed similar rules. They limited leadership. They distributed wealth transparently. They compensated injury. They punished betrayal severely. They relied on consent. This consistency mattered. It suggested that pirate democracy was not the product of a single charismatic leader or cultural tradition. It was a response to shared conditions. Where sailors faced exploitation, isolation, and danger, they gravitated toward collective governance. In this way, pirate ships resemble other frontier societies. Mining camps, remote settlements, military units cut off from command. In these environments, formal hierarchies often soften, not out of idealism, but out of necessity. Survival depends on cooperation, and cooperation depends on fairness. The sea was simply one of the earliest and harshest frontiers. As this understanding spread, the image of pirates shifted again. Not toward heroism, but toward complexity. They were no longer just enemies of trade or symbols of lawlessness. They were participants in a broader struggle over power and labor in the early modern world. This reframing also forced uncomfortable questions. If pirates could govern themselves effectively, what did that say about the systems they rejected? If democracy could function among illiterate sailors under constant threat, why was it considered impossible or dangerous elsewhere? Authorities of the 18th century never answered these questions directly. They did not need to. Force was enough. But later generations, removed from the immediate threat, could afford to ask. The answers were not flattering to empire. Pirate democracy exposed how much coercion underpinned lawful order. It showed that obedience was often extracted, not earned. It revealed that alternatives existed, even if briefly, even if imperfectly. This does not make pirates moral exemplars. They stole. They killed. They disrupted lives. Their victims mattered. Any honest account must hold that truth alongside admiration for their internal systems. Pirate democracy was not a model to be copied wholesale. It was a phenomenon to be understood. And understanding it requires holding contradiction without resolution. Pirates believed in equality among themselves, but not universally. They practiced consent internally while denying it externally. They opposed tyranny aboard ship while inflicting fear beyond it. These contradictions were not accidental. They were the result of operating within a violent world. Empires did not give pirates the option of peaceful reform. They gave them exploitation or exclusion. Pirate democracy emerged in that narrow space between. As historians traced these dynamics, the Brotherhood gained new relevance. Not as a romantic fantasy, but as evidence that political ideas often emerge far from philosophy books. They arise where pressure is greatest, where systems fail, where people must improvise. This challenges how history is usually told. We are accustomed to seeing progress flow from thinkers to laws to institutions. Pirate democracy reverses that order. Practice came first. Theory never fully followed. The institution existed only briefly. Yet the idea endured. That endurance is subtle. It does not announce itself loudly. It appears in questions asked during labor disputes, in demands for accountability, in the insistence that leadership should be chosen, not imposed. These ideas surface again and again, detached from their origin. Most people who hold them have never heard of pirate articles. They do not need to. The Brotherhood's influence is diffuse, like salt in water. It cannot be isolated easily, but it changes the taste of everything it touches. This is why pirate democracy continues to attract attention today. Not because it offers solutions, but because it disrupts assumptions. It reminds us that governance is not reserved for elites. That order does not require oppression. That people, even under dire conditions, can organize themselves with surprising sophistication. The pirates themselves would likely be amused by this attention. They did not set out to make history. They wanted fair treatment, shared risk, and a chance to survive. That their choices would be studied centuries later would have meant little to them. And yet here we are, listening to the echo of voices carried by wind and waves. Men arguing on deck, hands raised in vote, articles read aloud against the creak of timber and the slap of water against hull. These moments were small. They did not last, but they mattered. As we drift further from the age that produced them, the temptation is to smooth out their edges, to turn them into symbols rather than realities. Pirate democracy resists this. It demands to be seen whole, contradictions included. It asks us to accept that progress is not linear, that freedom can appear in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most radical ideas emerge not from palaces or parliaments, but from overcrowded decks under black flags, on ships that everyone else wanted destroyed. The sea carried those ships away, but it did not carry the idea with them. That idea slipped quietly into the world, changed shape, and waited. As centuries passed, the memory of pirates drifted further from lived experience and closer to imagination. The men who had once voted on decks and argued over shares were gone, replaced by characters on paper and stage. This transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, shaped by distance, fear, and convenience. In the years immediately after the Golden Age ended, piracy was still a fresh wound. Merchants remembered losses. Families remembered executions. Governments remembered embarrassment. In this period, pirate democracy was deliberately ignored. Acknowledging it would have meant admitting that criminals had organized themselves more fairly than lawful institutions often did. So the stories were simplified. Pirates became villains without context. Their violence was emphasized. Their organization was dismissed as coincidence or deception. Any suggestion of equality was framed as hypocrisy. This was not accidental. It was necessary for restoring confidence in authority. But as time moved on, fear softened into curiosity. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, piracy no longer threatened global trade in the same way. Steam power, standing navies, and improved communication made a return of the Brotherhood unlikely. With danger reduced, imagination took over. Writers began to reshape pirates into symbols. Some portrayed them as romantic rebels, free spirits rejecting civilization. Others depicted them as comic figures, exaggerated and harmless. Both versions stripped away reality in different ways. Violence became stylized. Governance disappeared entirely. Democracy was replaced by the idea of absolute freedom, a captain who ruled by charm rather than consent. This shift mattered. The myth of the pirate as a lone outlaw erased the collective nature of pirate life. It replaced shared decision-making with individual heroism. The Brotherhood faded, replaced by the image of a singular figure standing apart from society. In doing so, something important was lost. Real pirate democracy was not about escaping rules. It was about creating them. It was not about isolation. It was about community under pressure. Myths prefer simplicity. History rarely offers it. Yet even distorted stories preserved fragments of truth. The idea that pirates rejected kings endured. The sense that they lived by their own codes survived. These fragments hinted at something deeper, even if they no longer explained it. Occasionally, a writer stumbled closer to reality. Some 19th century accounts mentioned pirate articles in passing. A few noted that captains were elected. These details were often treated as curiosities rather than central facts. They did not fit the dominant narrative and were quickly overshadowed. Still, they remained in print, waiting. In the 20th century, as social history gained prominence, scholars began to ask new questions. They looked not just at leaders and laws but at ordinary people, workers, sailors, those at the margins of power. In this context, piracy appeared again, not as fantasy, but as a labor phenomenon. Archives were reopened. Trial records were re-examined. Patterns emerged. The same rules, the same structures, the same language of fairness and consent appearing again and again. Pirate democracy was no longer invisible. It was simply inconvenient. This rediscovery did not suddenly make pirates heroes. Complicated them. And complication is often more unsettling than condemnation. It suggested that order and disorder were not opposites, but neighbors. That legality and legitimacy did not always align. That people labeled criminals might still be responding rationally to unjust systems. These ideas resonated beyond piracy. They influenced how historians thought about resistance more broadly. Slave revolts, mutinies, peasant uprisings, informal governance in oppressed communities. Pirate democracy became one example among many of how people adapt when formal systems fail them. In this wider context, the Brotherhood regained significance, not as a blueprint but as evidence. Evidence that democracy is not fragile by nature. Evidence that people do not need education or elite status to govern themselves. Evidence that shared rules can emerge wherever survival demands cooperation. The sea once again became central to this understanding. Ships are enclosed worlds. They amplify power dynamics. Abuse becomes impossible to ignore. In such environments, governance is not theoretical. It is immediate. If rules fail, people die. Pirates understood this intuitively. Their democracy was not idealistic. It was functional. It balanced authority with accountability because imbalance was dangerous. It punished betrayal harshly because trust was essential. It rewarded injury because bodies were currency. None of this was gentle, but it was coherent. As modern audiences encountered this version of piracy, reactions were mixed. Some resisted it, preferring the comfort of myths. Others leaned too far in the opposite direction, romanticizing pirates as early revolutionaries. Both missed the point. Pirate democracy was neither fantasy nor prophecy. It was a moment, response, a set of practices shaped by specific conditions. Its value lies not in what it promised, but in what it revealed. That governance is situational. That power adapts. That people will create order even in places defined by violence. And that those orders can challenge assumptions held by far more powerful institutions. The Brotherhood did not seek recognition. It did not ask to be remembered. Simply existed briefly where it was needed. And that may be why its echo feels so persistent. Because it reminds us that history is not only made by those who write laws and command armies, but also by those who negotiate fairness in the shadows, on the edges, far from approval. As the myths continue to evolve, and pirates remain fixtures of popular imagination, the real story waits beneath the surface. Quiet, patient, like the sea itself. By the time the 20th century had fully embraced the study of social history, pirate democracy had taken on a new significance. It was no longer merely a curiosity from the age of sail. It became a lens through which historians could understand labor, power, and resistance across the Atlantic world. The Brotherhood, once considered chaotic criminals, was now recognized as a community operating with logic, fairness, and deliberation, albeit under extreme and violent conditions. Historians began examining the mechanics of pirate life with unprecedented care. Ships were no longer seen merely as floating criminal dens, but as mobile microcosms of governance. Articles of agreement, once dismissed as quaint or naive, were scrutinized. Every clause about shares, compensation, or conduct became evidence of a sophisticated social contract. Even the punishments for theft or disobedience reveal a careful balancing act between authority and consent. The significance is clear. Pirate democracy was functional, not idealistic. It had rules because they were necessary, not because someone invented a philosophy. Leadership was conditional, not absolute. Captains were elected and could be removed. Crews voted. Disputes were arbitrated. Shares were calculated transparently. In other words, the Brotherhood operated on a rational understanding of fairness, built entirely outside the purview of kings, governors, or empires. This realization altered interpretations of the golden age of piracy. It was no longer just a period of lawlessness. It was a series of controlled experiments in social organization. Men who had been marginalized, unemployed, or otherwise powerless tested their ability to govern themselves. Their success was measured not by morality, but by survival and efficiency. They proved that even under extreme conditions, collective decision-making could function. The rediscovery of pirate democracy also challenged traditional narratives of authority. If sailors, uneducated and constantly threatened by disease, weather, and warships, could create functional governance, then hierarchy was not inherently necessary for order. It suggested that obedience could be earned rather than imposed, that leadership could be temporary and accountable. These lessons, subtle but potent, resonate far beyond piracy itself. Interestingly, the gendered and racial aspects of pirate life also gained attention. Women like Bonny and Mary Red, who fought alongside men and were accepted into crews, highlighted exceptions to contemporary norms. Black and mixed-race pirates were sometimes treated as equals, receiving shares and participating in votes. While these instances were neither universal nor fully egalitarian, they demonstrate that pirate democracy allowed a level of flexibility and inclusion rare for the era. As scholars revisited trial records, depositions, and letters, a pattern emerged. The Brotherhood was pragmatic. Equality and consent were not abstract ideals. They were survival mechanisms. In dangerous, unpredictable conditions, cohesion was critical. A man who felt cheated might mutiny or desert. A captain who ruled unilaterally risked revolt. Pirate democracy was designed to prevent such breakdowns while maximizing effectiveness. This practical orientation explains why pirate ships could sometimes outfight better-armed naval vessels. Discipline and motivation were maintained not by fear alone, but by mutual agreement. Men understood the rules, knew the consequences, and had a say in their own fate. Trust was the lifeblood of the ship. Beyond survival, the Brotherhood also influenced perceptions of justice. Unlike legal systems of the time, which were often slow, opaque, and heavily biased, pirate articles were transparent. Shares were calculated according to clear formulas. Punishments were standardized. Injuries received compensation. These practices reflected a deep understanding of human behavior. Fairness fosters loyalty, and predictability reduces conflict. Pirate democracy, however, had limits. It was effective within the boundaries of the ship and the immediate needs of survival, but it could not withstand the full weight of empire. Increasing naval patrols, coordinated efforts among European powers, and the spread of intelligence networks eventually crushed the Brotherhood. The experiment was fragile in the face of overwhelming external pressure, yet its legacy endured. By the mid-20th century, historians began to explore how these lessons extended beyond piracy. They observed echoes of the Brotherhood in labor movements, sailors' unions, and worker cooperatives. The principle remained the same. When people have a direct stake in decisions, and when authority is accountable, cohesion and efficiency improve. Pirate democracy was, in essence, an early model of participatory governance in extreme conditions. And so, the Brotherhood's story gained new life. Far from the lurid tales of bloodthirsty villains, it became a story of negotiation, fairness, and shared responsibility. Its lessons, though born on the waves, transcended the ocean. They applied to any group of people working under stress, risk, and uncertainty. Even today, the echoes are audible. In small teams, in tight-knit communities, in workplaces and cooperatives, the principles of consent, shared risk, and equitable reward continue to guide human behavior. The pirates themselves are long gone, but the logic they lived by survives, quietly, in unexpected places. This is the remarkable thing about pirate democracy. It was temporary, violent, and often morally ambiguous, yet enduring. It proved that human beings, when given no other recourse, can organize themselves in ways that are fair, functional, and surprisingly resilient. And while empires may have won the battles, the Brotherhood left a mark that outlived the hangings, the burned ships, and the black flags. The 20th century was only the beginning of pirate democracy's slow transformation from historical footnote to cultural touchstone. As historians dug deeper, and as popular culture began to embrace pirates in films, novels, and illustrations, the idea of shared governance aboard pirate ships became a subtle undercurrent in the myths, often obscured but never completely erased. It existed there, like an undertow beneath a crashing wave. Quiet, persistent, shaping perception without demanding acknowledgement. Early film portrayals in the 1920s and 1930s presented pirates as swashbuckling heroes or comical villains. Rarely did any narrative reflect the complex structure of articles or voting rights aboard ship. Instead, the focus was on the daring of the captain, the romance of adventure, or the threat of violence. In other words, popular imagination simplified the Brotherhood into singular figures, erasing the collective dynamics that had sustained them. Yet, for those who looked closely, traces remained. Writers occasionally described elections, the distribution of plunder, or the code that governed behavior. These moments were often brief, almost incidental. A passing remark about the men voting on their captain, or shares divided fairly after a raid. Such glimpses hinted that pirates were not simply anarchic, but rather participants in a fragile democracy, even amid chaos. The mid-20th century saw renewed academic attention. Scholars began to cross-reference trial records, depositions, and surviving articles to reconstruct the lived experience of pirate crews. They realized that pirate democracy was not a novelty of a single ship or captain but a widespread phenomenon across the Caribbean, the Atlantic, and even parts of the Indian Ocean. Despite differences in leadership, composition, or region, crews consistently displayed similar patterns. Elected captains, shared risk, codified punishment, and transparent compensation. This realization prompted deeper reflection. Pirate democracy was more than a curiosity. It was evidence that human beings could self-organize effectively in environments of extreme danger and uncertainty. It challenged assumptions that governance must be hierarchical, rigid, or state-sanctioned to function. Pirates had proven, in the crucible of constant threat, that collective decision-making could work, and could work well enough to challenge powerful empires. Cultural portrayals, however, continued to diverge from historical reality. Novels like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island transformed pirates into archetypes. Cunning captains, treacherous first mates, and brave young protagonists. Readers absorbed images of mutiny and moral ambiguity, but the subtler, egalitarian structures of pirate society were largely lost. The Brotherhood's governance became an invisible subtext, discernible only to those who studied maritime history with care. Ironically, this invisibility may have helped preserve the idea in certain ways. Because popular narratives ignored the organizational aspects of piracy, they allowed historians to reintroduce them later without needing to battle entrenched misconceptions. By the late 20th century, a clear picture began to emerge. Pirate democracy was a functional, socially embedded system that prioritized consent, equity, and shared responsibility, even under extreme and violent circumstances. The more historians studied these systems, the more parallels they found in other frontier or isolated environments. Mining camps, logging communities, and frontier settlements frequently developed informal codes to distribute resources fairly and arbitrate disputes. Sailors, miners, and laborers created mechanisms for accountability, mirroring the logic of pirate articles. In every case, collective governance emerged as a solution to shared risk and precarious conditions. This realization added weight to the notion that pirate democracy was not an anomaly. Instead, it was part of a broader pattern of human adaptation. When formal authority fails or is absent entirely, people improvise their own rules. They balance freedom and accountability. They reward loyalty and punish betrayal. They negotiate the impossible, Interestingly, pirate democracy also survived in linguistic and symbolic ways. Phrases like equal share and vote of the crew persisted in maritime folklore. Local port traditions occasionally referenced pirate codes, albeit vaguely. These linguistic remnants functioned as cultural memory, embedding the principles of shared governance into collective consciousness even after the ships themselves were gone. As scholars of the 21st century examine piracy today, they see the duality clearly. The historical reality was complex, violent, pragmatic, and morally ambiguous. The mythologized image is colorful, adventurous, and simplified. Yet both reflect the same enduring fascination: the idea that people, even in the most dangerous circumstances, can claim agency and shape their own lives collectively. This fascination explains why pirate democracy continues to resonate. Challenges assumptions about authority, fairness, and human nature. It offers a narrative in which ordinary men and women, sailors, outcasts, and marginalized individuals, could create meaningful systems under extreme stress. And perhaps most importantly, it shows that governance is not confined to institutions, palaces, or parliaments. It can emerge anywhere human beings must cooperate to survive. In understanding this, we also understand the fragility of the Brotherhood. Its success relied on shared trust, common purpose, and constant participation. As naval pressure increased, as economic conditions shifted, and as mortality claims its toll, the Brotherhood inevitably unraveled. Yet its ideas outlived its ships, its flags, and even the men themselves. Even now, when historians or enthusiasts study pirate codes, the lesson is clear. The Brotherhood's true legacy was not treasure, terror, or legend. It was an experiment in human organization under duress. It was a fleeting but significant model of democracy, messy, practical, and alive. And like the sea itself, it leaves traces that ripple outward long after the waves have passed. As the echoes of pirate democracy stretched into the modern era, historians began tracing how the principles established on decks under black flags influenced broader maritime culture. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, merchant navies and even naval forces started to adjust practices, not because they admired pirates, but because they recognized the practical value of shared governance in maintaining crew cohesion. The lessons of the Brotherhood, though indirect, were being absorbed quietly. For instance, sailors who had survived the age of piracy often returned to lawful work with habits that reflected their experiences. They expected clarity in compensation, accountability in leadership, and equitable treatment in disputes. Captains who ignored these expectations faced mutiny or desertion. The practical reality mirrored the logic of pirate articles. Fairness and consent are central to group survival. Even as governments attempted to suppress piracy completely, they inadvertently confirmed its principles. Reports of mutinies in the Royal Navy often cited grievances about unfair treatment or withheld wages. Sailors invoked comparisons, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, between oppressive ship hierarchies and the freedom they had once experienced under pirate democracy. The legacy was subtle, but undeniable. The Brotherhood had taught that when authority is unjust, ordinary people can and will enforce their own standards. Meanwhile, popular culture began to play a dual role. Pirates appeared in novels, theater, and eventually films, often as symbols of rebellion or adventure. In these stories, captains were depicted as charismatic and often tyrannical, yet the narrative tension sometimes mirrored the realities of pirate governance. Audiences saw mutinies, votes, and conflicts over fairness, though they were dramatized, exaggerated, or romanticized. The basic principle remained: people respond to leadership that is perceived as unjust, and will collectively act to restore balance. Academics in the 20th century increasingly connected these dots. Comparative studies between pirate crews and other isolated high-risk communities revealed a pattern. When individuals face life and death stakes in a confined environment, democratic structures emerge organically. Collective decision-making, transparent reward systems, and enforceable rules appear not because of ideology, but because they are practical. Pirate democracy became an early, dramatic case study of human adaptability under extreme conditions. This perspective shifted the discussion of piracy from simple moral judgment to social analysis. Pirates were no longer only criminals. They were participants in an improvised system of governance, responding rationally to the pressures of their environment. They created order where none existed, managed conflict among equals, and maintained accountability without the oversight of kings, judges, or parliaments. This reframing emphasized the ingenuity and resilience of the Brotherhood, rather than its violence or notoriety alone. By the mid-20th century, the academic focus turned to the social dynamics within pirate communities. Researchers explored the roles of women like Bonny and Mary Red, whose participation in combat and governance demonstrated that pirate democracy could, at times, transcend gender norms. They examined the integration of black and mixed-race sailors, noting that while equality was not universal, pirate ships often provided unprecedented opportunities for inclusion relative to contemporary society. These findings highlighted the adaptability and pragmatism at the heart of the Brotherhood system. The more scholars studied these structures, the more they recognized their sophistication. Pirate democracy was not a chaotic experiment. It was a functional adaptation to extreme and volatile conditions. Leadership was conditional, authority was accountable, and participation was essential. Survival depended on cooperation, and cooperation required fairness. When any of these elements failed, the ship, and often the crew, faced disaster. It is worth noting that pirate democracy also illuminated the limits of human governance. The Brotherhood could flourish only under certain circumstances. A strong, cohesive crew, an understanding of shared risk, and the absence of overwhelming external power. As European navies improved their coordination, communication, and firepower, pirate autonomy became increasingly untenable. The same system that had thrived under conditions of moderate threat could not survive against concentrated, technologically superior forces. Yet even in decline, the principles of shared governance had left a lasting impression. By the late 20th century, pirate democracy had become a touchstone for broader discussions about collective decision-making, labor relations, and social cooperation. Its legacy could be traced not only in maritime history but in the study of labor unions, worker cooperatives, and other voluntary associations where fairness, consent, and accountability were essential. The Brotherhood's experiment demonstrated that democracy could emerge outside formal institutions, that governance was not solely the province of elites, and that ordinary people, when organized, could create order even in the harshest environments. And as historians, writers, and cultural commentators continued to revisit these stories, they recognized a persistent truth. The Brotherhood was not immortal in its ships or flags, but its principles endured, embedded quietly in human behavior, labor organization, and the imagination of those willing to look beneath the surface of myth. As we move closer to the modern perception of pirate democracy, it becomes evident that the Brotherhood's influence extended beyond the immediate maritime world. Their principles, conditional leadership, collective decision-making, and transparent distribution of resources, resurfaced in unexpected ways. Labor historians, political theorists, and cultural commentators began tracing the subtle threads connecting the golden age of piracy to later movements for worker rights and participatory governance. In the 19th century, for instance, sailors' unions began forming across Europe and North America. While these unions were far more structured and institutionalized than pirate crews, the logic was familiar. Authority must be accountable, and participation in decision-making is essential to morale and survival. Stories from maritime folklore, including accounts of pirate articles, provided examples, both cautionary and aspirational, of how communities organize under shared pressure. Even if never explicitly cited, the precedent existed in memory. Pirate democracy also influenced local governance in port cities. Town councils and harbor authorities occasionally observed that sailors returning from pirate-infested waters demanded fairness and transparency. Wage disputes, disputes over provisioning, and complaints about discipline were all filtered through the lens of what the sailors had learned aboard pirate ships. Former pirates, or men who had sailed with them, carried expectations of consent, accountability, and equitable treatment into lawful, regulated labor. Meanwhile, literary and cultural representations continued to evolve. While the romanticized image of pirates dominated novels and films, a subtler understanding of their social structures began to appear in scholarly works and detailed maritime histories. Researchers highlighted how elected captains, codified rules, and agreed-upon shares reflected a form of proto-democracy adapted for extreme environments. Even in exaggerated or fictionalized portrayals, fragments of this structure persisted. Mutiny, negotiation, and egalitarianism became recurring motifs, reminding audiences that piracy was not merely chaos, it was choice under duress. The enduring fascination with pirate democracy lies in its paradoxical nature. On one hand, pirates were violent, opportunistic, and self-interested. On the other hand, they maintained governance systems that prioritized fairness, distributed risk, and enforced accountability. This combination of brutality and pragmatism makes the Brotherhood compelling. It challenges conventional assumptions about morality, law, and human behavior. The global reach of piracy further amplified its influence. Crews operated not only in the Caribbean but also along the African coasts, in the Indian Ocean, and in parts of the Atlantic. Wherever they sailed, the logic of their democracy followed. Elected captains, transparent reward systems, and consensual decision-making were remarkably consistent across continents and cultures. This repetition suggests that pirate democracy was less an invention of specific leaders than a response to the universal challenges of isolated, high-risk seafaring life. Historians also note that the Brotherhood's practices had ripple effects even in official maritime operations. As European navies expanded and global trade intensified, understanding crew cohesion became essential. Officers observed that rigid hierarchy alone could not maintain discipline. Lessons from pirate conduct, though never openly acknowledged, contributed to evolving strategies for managing crews, ensuring loyalty, and distributing rewards effectively. In other words, pirate democracy influenced the very structures that sought to destroy it. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the study of pirate governance extended into interdisciplinary fields. Political scientists, anthropologists, and sociologists examined the Brotherhood as a case study in emergent governance. They asked, how do small, self-contained communities manage conflict? How are leaders chosen and held accountable? How does collective decision-making function under threat? Pirate democracy offered answers not through theory, but through lived experience documented in articles, trial records, and contemporary reports. What becomes clear in this broader context is that pirate democracy was not merely historical curiosity. It represents a tangible demonstration that humans, even under extreme constraints, will seek fairness and shared authority. It proves that governance is not inherently hierarchical. It can emerge organically where necessity demands it. And it reminds us that even marginalized or outlawed groups can develop functional, enduring social systems. At the same time, the Brotherhood's legacy is inherently bittersweet. Despite their ingenuity, pirate democracy could not withstand the combined weight of imperial power. Naval campaigns, improved intelligence, and international cooperation eventually crushed the remaining crews. Ships were burned, flags torn down, and men hanged. The system, so innovative and effective in microcosm, could not survive against a global military apparatus. Yet the memory of their governance, recorded in scattered archives, trial transcripts, and folklore, ensured that the principles persisted, long after the black flags disappeared. This duality, short-lived in practice, enduring in influence, is central to the story. Pirate democracy challenges the notion that only enduring institutions matter. It shows that even temporary experiments in self-governance can leave lasting impressions on culture, labor practices, and collective imagination. As pirate democracy moved further into historical memory, its influence on thought, labor practices, and culture became more apparent, though often indirect. By the 19th century, industrialization and the growth of global maritime trade created environments in which the principles forged on pirate decks found new relevance. Sailors, dockworkers, and other laborers faced conditions not unlike those of the 18th century pirate crews. Long hours, dangerous work, limited recourse against abuse, and dependence on leadership that could be fair or tyrannical. Former pirates, or men who had sailed alongside them, carried memories and habits into these environments. They expected clarity in assignments, transparency in pay, and some measure of say in decisions affecting daily survival. When these expectations were not met, mutinies, strikes, and organized resistance emerged. In this sense, pirate democracy, though crushed on the seas, left a subtle imprint on labor relations far beyond the Caribbean or Atlantic waters. Cultural portrayals of pirates during the 19th and early 20th centuries continued to evolve. Novelists and illustrators emphasized adventure, betrayal, and intrigue, often romanticizing the violence while minimizing the organizational sophistication. Yet glimpses of governance persisted in descriptions of mutiny, collective decisions, and shared spoils. Even when hidden under narrative flourish, the logic of the Brotherhood, the conditional authority of captains, the accountability of leaders, the negotiated distribution of wealth, remained a persistent subtext. Academic study in the 20th century brought the Brotherhood into sharper focus. Researchers examined trial transcripts, port records, and personal letters to reconstruct not just the acts of piracy but the underlying social structures. These studies revealed consistent practices: captains elected by vote, codified articles governing conduct, equal or proportional division of plunder, and compensation for injuries. Far from chaotic, these practices reveal a system of order developed organically to meet specific challenges. The enduring lesson is both practical and philosophical. Pirate democracy demonstrates that effective governance is possible without coercion or formal hierarchy, provided that rules are clear, consent is respected, and trust is maintained. Leadership is temporary, conditional, and accountable. Authority exists to serve the group, not dominate it. These principles apply not only to the seas but to any context in which people must cooperate under stress and risk. Interestingly, pirate democracy also sheds light on inclusivity and social flexibility. Women like Bonny and Mary participated in combat and shared decision-making. Black and mixed-race sailors were sometimes integrated into crews, receiving shares and voting rights under the Articles. These practices were far from universal, and they were shaped by practicality as much as principle, but they demonstrate that pirate governance could accommodate diversity in ways unusual for the period. The collapse of the golden age of piracy did not erase the underlying logic. Imperial navies, merchant companies, and labor systems all absorbed fragments of what pirates had demonstrated. The Royal Navy, for example, eventually recognized that overbearing authority could provoke revolt. Merchant vessels began codifying wage agreements and establishing clearer expectations. While these changes were not inspired directly by admiration, the practical lessons of the Brotherhood influenced maritime practice. Meanwhile, the mythologized image of pirates continued to evolve. Films, novels, and later television shows emphasized rebellion and freedom, often at the expense of historical accuracy. Yet even in these portrayals, the essence of shared authority and collective consequence appears in subtler forms. Mutiny, loyalty, betrayal, and negotiation, core aspects of pirate democracy, remain recurring themes, highlighting the enduring human fascination with agency, consent, and fairness. By the mid-20th century, scholars began to connect pirate democracy with broader social theory. The Brotherhood became a case study in emergent governance. How people organize themselves, enforce rules, and maintain cooperation in high-stress environments. The focus shifted from romantic adventure to functional sociology. What had once been treated as criminal chaos was revealed as a sophisticated, context-dependent system for survival and organization. This perspective reframes the legacy of the Brotherhood. Pirates were not merely outlaws. They were participants in an improvised social experiment that tested the boundaries of authority, accountability, and cooperation. They demonstrated that even marginalized individuals could create functioning governance under extreme conditions, a lesson that resonates far beyond the golden age of sail. Yet, as always, the story is bittersweet. Pirate democracy could not withstand concentrated imperial pressure. Naval forces, intelligence networks, and coordinated patrols ultimately destroyed the system in practice. Ships were captured, crews executed, and flags torn down. The Brotherhood's experiment was extinguished, but the principles it embodied survived. In memory, in labor culture, and in the ongoing fascination with the idea that ordinary people can govern themselves when conditions demand it. Even after the last pirate crews were scattered and the black flags had vanished from the seas, the principles of pirate democracy continued to echo quietly in human organization. What had been forged under constant threat, in cramped quarters with limited resources, proved surprisingly resilient in memory and practice. These principles, consent, conditional leadership, shared risk, and transparent distribution of resources, found subtle expression in the practices of sailors, laborers, and communities far removed from the golden age of piracy. In port cities of Europe and the Americas, men who had once served under pirate articles returned to lawful work, carrying the habits of shared governance with them. They were more likely to question authority, negotiate terms, and ensure fairness in wage distribution. Captains, shipowners, and officers quickly learned that ignoring these expectations could provoke mutiny or desertion. The practical lessons of the Brotherhood had migrated from sea to shore, quietly shaping human behavior in environments of risk and labor. Scholars of the 20th century emphasized this point. Pirate democracy, they argued, was not merely a historical curiosity. It was an early and extreme example of participatory governance. Leadership was conditional, accountability was enforced, and collective decision-making was essential for survival. The system was pragmatic, not ideological. It succeeded not because of philosophy but because it worked under high stakes. The logic of the Brotherhood applied wherever cooperation was required for safety, productivity, or shared success. This perspective also highlights the adaptability of pirate democracy. Crews had diverse compositions. Men of different nationalities, backgrounds, and sometimes races, as well as women like Bonny and Mary Red. Although not perfectly egalitarian, pirate articles provided mechanisms for inclusion that were exceptional for the period. Rights and responsibilities were negotiated, and benefits were distributed according to agreed-upon rules. The system was both flexible and structured, capable of accommodating differences while maintaining order. Cultural depictions of pirates during the 20th century, while often romanticized, began to incorporate glimpses of this social logic. Mutinies, negotiations, and disputes over fair shares appeared repeatedly in novels, films, and plays. Even when dramatized or exaggerated, these moments preserved the essence of pirate democracy. The idea that authority is earned, that power can be challenged, and that collective decision-making can exist even under extreme conditions. The study of pirate democracy also contributed to broader discussions about labor and governance. Historians observed parallels between pirate crews and other isolated high-risk communities, such as mining camps, logging settlements, and early industrial workplaces. In these contexts, informal codes of conduct emerged to regulate behavior, enforce accountability, and ensure equitable distribution of resources. Pirate articles served as an early dramatic example of this universal pattern. Where necessity dictates, people organize themselves to survive. Despite its practicality, the Brotherhood's governance had inherent limits. Pirate democracy thrived in small, cohesive crews with shared purpose. It was contingent on trust, participation, and mutual dependence. Against the overwhelming naval power of European empires, these systems could not endure indefinitely. Ships were captured, crews executed, and the black flags disappeared. Yet the logic of the Brotherhood endured, recorded in archives, port records, trial transcripts, and oral tradition. Modern scholars see pirate democracy as a lens for understanding human behavior under stress. It demonstrates that governance can emerge organically, that authority need not be hierarchical, and that shared decision-making can function effectively in extreme conditions. The Brotherhood also highlights the complexity of moral judgment. Pirates were violent, opportunistic, and self-interested, yet capable of remarkable fairness and organization within their communities. This duality, the simultaneous brutality and pragmatism of pirate democracy, makes it enduringly fascinating. It reminds us that human systems are rarely purely good or purely evil, and that even temporary experiments in governance can leave lasting legacies. The Brotherhood may have vanished from the seas, but the principles it embodied continue to inform our understanding of cooperation, accountability, and collective agency. The more historians study these practices, the clearer it becomes that pirate democracy is not simply an anomaly of history. It is a window into human adaptability, a demonstration that even under extreme constraints, people organize, negotiate, and enforce rules that balance freedom, accountability, and shared survival. Its story continues to challenge assumptions about hierarchy, obedience, and the conditions necessary for governance. Pirate democracy, when examined not just as historical fact but as a social phenomenon, reveals layers of philosophical and symbolic meaning that extend far beyond the decks of 18th century ships. At its core, the Brotherhood embodies a simple yet profound truth: that human beings instinctively seek fairness, accountability, and participation, even in environments defined by danger, scarcity, and violence. The ships themselves, floating microcosms of society, became laboratories in which these principles were tested continuously. Every voyage presented a delicate balance. Captains were elected based on skill, charisma, and judgment, but their authority was always conditional. Crews voted on major decisions, ranging from choosing targets to setting rules of conduct. Articles codified expectations and punishments, ensuring that even the most marginalized crew members understood their rights and obligations. The system was not perfect, and it was certainly harsh by modern standards, yet it functioned remarkably well under constant threat. This functionality is what distinguishes pirate democracy from idealized notions of governance. It was pragmatic rather than philosophical, born out of necessity rather than ideology. Yet its principles resonate with core concepts of modern democratic theory: consent of the governed, accountability of leaders, transparency in decision-making, and equitable distribution of resources. The genius of the Brotherhood lies in applying these abstract ideals to the concrete realities of survival at sea. The philosophical implications are subtle but powerful. Pirate democracy challenges the assumption that authority must be centralized or enforced through fear. It demonstrates that even marginalized individuals, operating outside formal structures of power, can create effective governance when their survival depends on it. In doing so, the Brotherhood provides an early and vivid example of distributed authority, showing that leadership is a responsibility rather than an entitlement. Symbolically, pirate democracy also embodies resistance against exploitation. Sailors joined pirate crews not merely for wealth, but for a measure of autonomy denied to them under state or corporate authority. The Articles codified fairness, protected individual rights, and punished breaches of trust. This insistence on mutual accountability was revolutionary in its context, and it resonates today as a reminder that systems of power can and should be challenged when they fail to serve those they govern. The Brotherhood's practices also illuminate the role of trust in any functional society. Without trust, even the most carefully crafted articles would have been meaningless. Captains depended on crews to follow orders in battle, while crews depended on captains for strategic decisions and equitable distribution of plunder. Injuries were compensated, shares were divided transparently, and violations were punished according to pre-agreed rules. The system thrived because participants believed in the fairness of the framework, demonstrating that trust is both the foundation and the outcome of effective governance. Moreover, pirate democracy's influence extends beyond governance into cultural imagination. Literature, film, and folklore preserve the tensions inherent in the system: rebellion versus loyalty, freedom versus responsibility, self-interest versus collective good. Even when mythologized, these narratives reflect enduring questions about authority, consent, and human organization. Audiences are drawn to pirates not merely because of adventure or violence, but because the story dramatizes the human struggle to balance individual and collective needs. In modern terms, the Brotherhood can be viewed as an early experiment in participatory ethics. Every vote, every article, every enforcement of agreed-upon rules reflects an understanding that fairness and cooperation are essential to survival. It anticipates contemporary discussions in organizational behavior, cooperative economics, and social psychology about how humans negotiate shared authority under stress. The lessons are surprisingly applicable today. Whether in corporate teams, social movements, or small communities, the principles of pirate democracy, clarity, accountability, and consent remain relevant. Yet the story is also a cautionary tale. Pirate democracy flourished only in a narrow window. Small crews, high-risk conditions, and isolation from overwhelming external power. As European navies gained strength, trade networks expanded, and surveillance increased, the Brotherhood could no longer operate safely. Their system, so adaptive and effective in its time, ultimately collapsed under external pressures. This fragility underscores a broader truth. Even the most ingenious social arrangements require favorable conditions to survive. Still, the ideas persist. The logic of shared governance, the insistence on fairness, and the principle that authority must answer to those it governs have traveled far beyond the oceans of the Caribbean and Atlantic. They appear subtly in labor movements, cooperative ventures, maritime unions, and even organizational leadership today. Pirate democracy, though violent and transient, proved that governance is not confined to formal institutions. It can emerge wherever human beings must coordinate, cooperate, and survive together. As we trace the influence of pirate democracy further into history, its echoes become increasingly apparent, not just in maritime practice, but in broader social and cultural contexts. The principles forged under black flags, consent, accountability, and equitable distribution, found subtle expression in later labor movements, cooperative ventures, and social organizations that relied on voluntary cooperation rather than coercion. While the golden age of piracy ended abruptly, the logic of the Brotherhood persisted quietly, like an undercurrent beneath the surface of history. In the 19th century, as industrial labor expanded, workers faced conditions that were harsh, hierarchical, and often exploitative. In maritime trade, long hours, meager pay, and risk of injury or death created a climate not unlike the environment that had given rise to pirate democracy. Sailors returning from service at sea, some with experience on pirate or quasi-pirate vessels, carried with them expectations of fairness, transparency, and accountability. These expectations could not always be met, and when they were ignored, mutinies and labor disputes erupted, echoing the logic of pirate articles in a new context. Historians have noted that these parallels were more than coincidental. The Brotherhood had demonstrated that effective governance could emerge organically under pressure, that leadership must be accountable, and that shared decision-making is essential to maintaining cohesion. Employers and officers who ignored these lessons often paid the price. Over time, formalized labor structures, wage agreements, and cooperative decision-making mechanisms developed, reflecting principles that had first been tested on pirate ships. Cultural representations of piracy continued to evolve in parallel. Novels, plays, and later films romanticized pirates as symbols of freedom and rebellion, emphasizing adventure and heroism while obscuring the more mundane but crucial aspects of governance. Yet even in these mythologized portrayals, themes of negotiation, loyalty, and collective decision-making appeared. Audiences responded to the tension between individual initiative and group responsibility, unknowingly absorbing lessons that the Brotherhood had embodied in practice. Scholarly interest in pirate democracy also illuminated its social flexibility. Crews were diverse in composition, including men from multiple nations, races, and occasionally women who participated directly in combat and decision-making. While not perfect, these arrangements demonstrated a pragmatic approach to inclusion. The system functioned because it adapted to circumstances, recognizing talent, skill, and trustworthiness over rigid social norms. This flexibility was a crucial factor in the effectiveness and cohesion of pirate crews. At the same time, the collapse of the Golden Age highlighted the limits of these practices. Pirate democracy was fragile in the face of concentrated imperial power. European navies, intelligence networks, and coordinated patrols eventually crushed the Brotherhood. Ships were captured, crews executed, and flags torn down. The experiment ended violently and abruptly. Yet its principles survived in memory, documentation, and the enduring fascination of historians and cultural audiences alike. Modern scholars interpret the Brotherhood as an early, extreme case of participatory governance. It demonstrates that authority need not be absolute, that cooperation can emerge under pressure, and that fairness and accountability are essential for collective survival. The lessons are remarkably relevant today, informing studies of organizational behavior, cooperative economics, and leadership ethics. Where people must work together under high stakes, the principles of pirate democracy continue to apply. Clarity, consent, shared risk, and enforceable agreements. Even in literature and film, pirate democracy subtly informs the narrative. The tension between obedience and autonomy, the negotiation of power within the group, and the consequences of betrayal reflect the lived realities of pirate crews. Myths simplify the spectacle of piracy, but they cannot erase the underlying human fascination with systems that balance freedom and responsibility. The Brotherhood's logic resonates because it is human, adaptive, and deeply practical. Ultimately, pirate democracy serves as both historical record and philosophical lens. It reminds us that governance can emerge outside formal institutions, that marginalized groups can organize effectively, and that collective decision-making is not only possible but often necessary in extreme circumstances. Its story is one of ingenuity, pragmatism, and resilience, a fleeting but enduring experiment in human organization under duress. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pirate democracy had moved entirely from practice to memory, yet its principles continued to resonate. Historians, labor organizers, and maritime scholars began to recognize the underlying patterns. The Articles of Agreement, the election of captains, and the compensation for injuries were more than idiosyncrasies. They were functional responses to extreme conditions. In effect, pirate democracy had become a case study in human adaptability and social innovation. One of the most striking aspects of the Brotherhood was its reliance on trust and mutual accountability. Crews were often composed of strangers from diverse backgrounds, speaking different languages, and coming from varying social strata. Despite these differences, the Articles established clear expectations, and adherence was enforced collectively. A captain could not act purely on whim. The crew had the power to depose him. Spoils were divided transparently, and disputes over shares or conduct were resolved openly. This system functioned because everyone had a stake in its success. Labor historians have traced these principles into other maritime contexts. Merchant vessels and naval crews gradually adopted more structured agreements, wage transparency, and formalized systems of accountability. Not because they were inspired by piracy, but because the logic of fair treatment proved effective. Sailors familiar with pirate practices demanded clarity in their contracts and participation in decisions affecting their welfare. Where this was ignored, unrest and mutiny often followed, demonstrating the enduring relevance of the Brotherhood's approach. Cultural representations of pirates continued to oscillate between fantasy and reality. Popular novels, films, and theater dramatized adventure, violence, and rebellion, frequently obscuring the democratic mechanisms that allowed crews to survive and thrive. Yet even in mythologized narratives, traces of governance persisted. Decisions made collectively, disputes adjudicated among equals, and consequences for betrayal all reflect the structural realities of pirate life. These glimpses serve as subtle reminders that even romanticized depictions of pirates carry the echo of social experimentation. Pirate democracy also challenges modern assumptions about hierarchy and authority. The Brotherhood demonstrates that order does not require coercion, that leadership is effective only when it is accountable, and that collective action can sustain cohesion even under extreme stress. Captains were respected not because of rank, but because they demonstrated skill, judgment, and adherence to agreed-upon norms. The system required constant negotiation, vigilance, and participation, a lesson in the delicate balance between freedom and responsibility. The diversity within pirate crews further illustrates the adaptability of this system. Men from different nations, races, and social backgrounds, as well as women like Bonny and Mary Red, could participate in governance under specific conditions. Inclusion was pragmatic. based on the necessity of maintaining cohesion and trust. The Brotherhood thus provides an early example of organizational flexibility, where ability and loyalty could outweigh social prejudice, a concept rarely observed in contemporary formal institutions. However, the fragility of pirate democracy is equally instructive. Its survival depended on isolation from overwhelming external power. As naval technology improved, intelligence networks expanded, and coordinated patrols increased, pirate crews could no longer maintain autonomy. Their governance collapsed under the weight of empire, and the system that had thrived under high-stakes conditions vanished. Yet its principles, fairness, consent, accountability, and shared risk, remained documented, remembered, and occasionally reinterpreted. Modern scholarship often positions pirate democracy as a foundational example of emergent governance. It is studied not for moral lessons, but for its pragmatic effectiveness. Where hierarchies fail, where risk is shared, and where survival depends on cohesion, the Brotherhood's practices illustrate how humans can self-organize. Leadership is contingent, decision-making is collective, and compliance is secured through mutual interest rather than coercion. These insights continue to inform contemporary discussions in organizational theory, social psychology, and cooperative economics. The enduring fascination with pirate democracy lies in its combination of pragmatism, inclusivity, and moral ambiguity. Pirates were simultaneously violent and cooperative, self-interested yet bound by collective norms. Their system worked because it adapted to extreme circumstances, balanced individual and group needs, and enforced agreements rigorously. It reminds us that governance is not limited to formal institutions, and that human ingenuity can flourish even in marginal and dangerous conditions. As the 20th century progressed, pirate democracy shifted from historical record to a framework for understanding human behavior under extreme conditions. Scholars and social theorists began to view the Brotherhood not merely as a curiosity of maritime history, but as a model for participatory governance, organizational ethics, and collective decision-making. In small crews, isolated and constantly facing danger, these principles were not abstract. They were vital for survival. The logic of pirate governance rests on a simple foundation. Authority must be earned and maintained through accountability. Captains were elected by the crew, and their power could be revoked if they failed to lead effectively or violated the agreed-upon code. Decisions about targets, plunder, and punishment were made collectively, ensuring that every member had a voice. Shares were allocated transparently, and injuries were compensated according to the articles. This structure ensured fairness while maintaining order under extreme risk. The adaptability of pirate democracy was remarkable. Crews were often diverse, with men of different nationalities, races, and occasionally women, all contributing to decision-making within the framework of the articles. Inclusion was pragmatic rather than ideological, based on skill, loyalty, and trust. This flexibility allowed the Brotherhood to function efficiently despite differences and under high-stress conditions, offering lessons for any cooperative human endeavor. Even after the golden age of piracy ended, the principles of the Brotherhood quietly influenced maritime labor. Returning sailors brought expectations of fairness, transparency, and accountability to merchant and naval vessels. When these expectations were ignored, unrest and mutiny followed. In subtle ways, pirate democracy shaped labor relations, reinforcing the idea that collective negotiation and shared decision-making are essential for cohesion and productivity. Cultural depictions of pirates continued to oscillate between myth and history. Popular novels, plays, and films emphasized adventure, treachery, and rebellion, often exaggerating violence while obscuring the democratic mechanisms of pirate life. Yet, underlying these stories were traces of governance. Mutiny, negotiation, and disputes over plunder reflected the Brotherhood's social logic. Even mythologized portrayals preserve the essence of pirate democracy, highlighting its relevance and enduring fascination. The collapse of pirate democracy under imperial pressure illustrates both its fragility and its significance. Naval patrols, intelligence networks, and coordinated campaigns eventually crushed pirate crews. Ships were burned, men executed, and flags torn down. Yet the logic of the Brotherhood, shared risk, conditional leadership, and transparent accountability, remained embedded in documents, trial records, and memory. The principles outlasted the vessels and the black flags. Modern scholars study pirate democracy as an example of emergent governance. Where hierarchies fail or external authority is absent, humans organize according to necessity. Collective decision-making, clear rules, and mutual accountability emerge not as ideological preferences but as practical adaptations to risk and scarcity. Leadership is contingent, compliance is voluntary, and survival depends on cohesion. The Brotherhood provides a vivid historical case study of these dynamics. Philosophically, pirate democracy challenges assumptions about power and human behavior. It shows that effective governance can exist without coercion, that fairness and trust are central to cooperation, and that authority is strongest when accountable to those it governs. Pirates were violent and opportunistic, yet their system demonstrates that even marginalized individuals can create order, distribute resources equitably, and maintain collective responsibility under duress. This combination of pragmatism, moral ambiguity, and adaptability is why pirate democracy continues to resonate. It provides lessons not only in history but in leadership, organizational behavior, and social cooperation. The Brotherhood demonstrates that fairness, consent, and accountability are practical, functional necessities, not just ideals, essential for survival in any high-risk, high-stakes environment. As we continue, the next batches will move into the final stages of the narrative, reflecting on the legacy of pirate democracy in modern thought, culture, and imagination, and preparing the story for its calming and reflective conclusion. By the early 21st century, the story of pirate democracy had fully entered the realm of reflection and analysis. It was no longer simply a tale of swashbuckling adventure or maritime crime, but a study in human organization, trust, and fairness under extreme conditions. The Brotherhood had demonstrated that governance could emerge organically, that leadership could be conditional, and that collective decision-making could function effectively even when survival was at stake. The enduring relevance of pirate democracy lies in its lessons about human behavior. Crews were composed of men, and occasionally women, from diverse backgrounds, yet they managed to cooperate through shared rules, transparent allocation of resources, and mutually enforced accountability. Captains were elected for skill and removed for failure. Disputes were adjudicated openly. Injuries were compensated. This system worked because it aligned individual incentives with collective survival, creating cohesion in the face of constant danger. These lessons extended beyond the seas. Labor movements, cooperative organizations, and even modern team-based workplaces reflect principles similar to those enforced on pirate ships. Where trust and fairness guide behavior, groups function more effectively. Where leadership is accountable and consent is respected, cohesion is stronger. Pirate democracy provides a historical example of these dynamics operating under extreme pressure, demonstrating that the principles are universally applicable, not bound to a single context. Culturally, the romanticized image of pirates persisted, yet scholars emphasized the social logic beneath the myth. Literature, films, and games often highlight mutiny, negotiation, and disputes over treasure, dramatic elements that echo the democratic structures once in place. Audiences are drawn to these stories not merely for action or spectacle, but because they depict the balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility, a balance that was central to pirate governance. The collapse of pirate democracy, while inevitable in the face of imperial power, reinforces the fragility of any system reliant on trust and participation. Naval campaigns, intelligence networks, and coordinated patrols eventually destroyed the Brotherhood. Yet the principles of conditional leadership, collective decision-making, and equitable distribution survived, documented in trial records, port registries, and maritime lore. The ships were gone, but the logic endured. Modern historians and theorists now view pirate democracy as a model of emergent governance. It illustrates that when conventional authority is absent or oppressive, humans naturally develop rules, assign responsibility, and enforce accountability. The Brotherhood demonstrates that cooperation is not merely idealistic. It is practical, functional, and often necessary for survival. Leadership is contingent, compliance is voluntary, and cohesion depends on trust. These lessons resonate in contemporary organizational and social theory. The symbolic dimension of pirate democracy is equally significant. It embodies resistance to exploitation, the practical assertion of agency, and the capacity of marginalized groups to organize effectively. Pirates were violent and self-interested, yet they adhered to agreed-upon rules that protected individual rights and ensured fairness. This tension between pragmatism and morality, between autonomy and accountability, contributes to the enduring fascination with pirate life and governance. Even today, the logic of pirate democracy continues to inspire reflection. From cooperative business models to collective decision-making in small communities, the principles of transparency, accountability, and shared responsibility remain central to functional social organization. The Brotherhood serves as a historical touchstone, illustrating that effective governance is not confined to formal institutions, but can emerge wherever humans face shared risks and rely on each other for survival. In understanding pirate democracy, we also gain insight into the resilience of human ingenuity. Under extreme circumstances, ordinary people can create systems that balance individual and collective needs, enforce accountability, and foster cohesion. The Brotherhood's experiment may have been violent, temporary, and morally ambiguous, yet it demonstrated the enduring capacity of humans to organize themselves effectively when circumstances demand. As the study of pirate democracy deepened, its significance extended beyond maritime history into broader philosophical and cultural conversations. The Brotherhood exemplified an emergent social order, one built on necessity, fairness, and trust rather than coercion. Historians, sociologists, and political theorists began to view the practices of pirate crews as early experiments in participatory governance, where leadership was accountable, rules were transparent, and survival depended on collective cohesion. The democratic mechanisms aboard pirate ships were surprisingly sophisticated. Captains were chosen by vote, and their authority was contingent upon performance. Decisions about plunder, navigation, and discipline were often made collectively, ensuring that the crew had a voice in matters directly affecting their lives. Articles of agreement codified these principles, defining shares, responsibilities, and punishments. Injuries sustained in battle were compensated, reflecting a system that balanced risk with fairness. In essence, pirate democracy was not an abstract ideal. It was a pragmatic solution to life and death challenges. The cultural resonance of these practices persisted long after the golden age of piracy ended. Literature, theater, and later film perpetuated stories of mutiny, negotiation, and collective decision-making, often romanticized but rooted in reality. Even when pirates were portrayed as lawless or violent, the undercurrent of governance and cooperation remained, reflecting the enduring fascination with human ingenuity and social balance under extreme conditions. Audiences were drawn not only to adventure, but to the subtle dynamics of authority, trust, and accountability that shaped life aboard ship. Pirate democracy also provides a lens to examine inclusivity and social flexibility. Crews often included men from diverse national, racial, and social backgrounds, as well as women like Bonny and Mary Red, who participated directly in combat and decision-making. While not perfectly egalitarian, these arrangements reveal a pragmatic approach. The Brotherhood prioritized trust, skill, and loyalty over rigid social hierarchies. This flexibility contributed to cohesion, demonstrating that effective governance often requires adaptation to circumstance rather than adherence to rigid ideology. The collapse of pirate democracy underscores its fragility. While effective under isolation and moderate threat, it could not withstand concentrated imperial power. Naval forces, intelligence networks, and coordinated patrols eventually eliminated pirate crews. Ships were captured, leaders executed, and flags torn down. Yet the principles of conditional leadership, shared decision-making, and equitable distribution survived in trial records, port documents, and cultural memory. The Brotherhood's logic endured even as its vessels disappeared from the seas. Modern interpretations view pirate democracy as a practical model for emergent governance. It demonstrates that humans organize naturally when conventional authority is absent or oppressive, establishing systems that balance freedom, accountability, and shared risk. Leadership is temporary and earned. Compliance is voluntary and incentivized. Cohesion depends on trust. These lessons resonate not only in historical analysis but in modern organizational theory, cooperative management, and community-based governance. Philosophically, the Brotherhood challenges assumptions about hierarchy, morality, and social order. Pirates were violent and self-interested, yet their governance structures maintained fairness, accountability, and cooperation. The tension between pragmatism and ethical responsibility, the balance between individual desire and collective need, offers enduring insights into human behavior under stress. Pirate democracy reminds us that even in marginal or outlawed communities, systems of organization can emerge that are both functional and principled. Culturally, the fascination with pirates reflects more than adventure. It reflects a fascination with agency, autonomy, and collective negotiation. The Brotherhood's legacy continues to inspire contemporary thinking about leadership, fairness, and cooperation. Whether in labor movements, cooperative organizations, or community-based initiatives, the principles established aboard pirate ships remain relevant. Clear rules, participatory decision-making, accountability, and equitable distribution are central to sustainable human organization. In examining these ripples, we begin to understand that pirate democracy was more than a historical curiosity. It was a human experiment in collective governance, forged under extreme conditions, and preserved in memory, culture, and scholarship. Its lessons transcend time and place, offering insight into how humans can organize themselves effectively, creatively, and fairly even in the harshest circumstances. As we move closer to the conclusion of the story, it becomes clear that pirate democracy is not merely a historical curiosity, but a profound example of human ingenuity under pressure. The Brotherhood operated in a world defined by danger, scarcity, and constant uncertainty, yet it consistently produced order, fairness, and cohesion. Captains were elected, decisions were shared, and plunder was distributed transparently. Every member had a voice, and authority was conditional, enforceable, and accountable. In this way, the pirate ship became a floating laboratory of social and political experimentation. One of the most remarkable aspects of pirate governance was its adaptability. Crews were often composed of individuals from diverse backgrounds, nations, and social statuses. Women, like in Bonny and Mary Red, were active participants in combat and decision-making. Black sailors, freed or escaped, could earn their place in the Brotherhood. While not perfectly egalitarian, pirate democracy functioned because it valued trust, skill, and loyalty above rigid social hierarchies. Necessity, not ideology, drove fairness, and practicality outweighed prejudice. Cultural memory preserved these lessons in subtle ways. Even in romanticized portrayals of piracy, themes of negotiation, rebellion, and collective decision-making appear repeatedly. Stories of mutiny, debate over treasure, and disputes resolved by vote echo the underlying structure of the Brotherhood. Audiences are drawn not only to the adventure but to the tension between individual autonomy and collective responsibility, a dynamic that defines pirate democracy. The collapse of the system underscores its fragility. Imperial navies, increasingly sophisticated and coordinated, eventually overpowered pirate crews. Ships were captured, leaders executed, and flags destroyed. Yet the principles of shared governance endured in records, folklore, and maritime culture. Trial transcripts, port archives, and contemporary accounts provide a window into how these crews organized themselves, negotiated power, and maintained cohesion under extraordinary circumstances. Modern scholars view pirate democracy as a compelling example of emergent governance. It demonstrates that people naturally create rules, assign authority, and enforce accountability when formal institutions are absent or oppressive. Leadership is conditional, compliance is voluntary, and cohesion depends on trust and fairness. The Brotherhood illustrates that collective decision-making and participatory governance are not only possible under extreme conditions but also practical, functional, and essential for survival. Philosophically, the Brotherhood challenges conventional assumptions about power, morality, and organization. Pirates were often violent, opportunistic, and self-interested, yet they upheld agreements that protected individual rights and distributed resources fairly. This tension between pragmatism and principle, self-interest and collective responsibility, makes pirate democracy a unique case study in human behavior. It reminds us that governance can emerge organically, even under duress, and that effective systems balance authority with accountability. The legacy of pirate democracy continues to inform modern thought. In organizational theory, cooperative economics, and community-based leadership, the principles first practiced aboard pirate ships remain relevant. Clear rules, collective decision-making, accountability, and equitable distribution are essential to sustaining any cooperative group. The Brotherhood demonstrates that these principles are not abstract ideals. They are practical solutions to complex, high-risk challenges. Through all of this, the human element remains central. Pirate democracy was not merely a system of rules. It was a living, adaptive experiment. Each crew navigated danger, conflict, and uncertainty, negotiating leadership and responsibility daily. In doing so, they produced a system that balanced freedom and accountability, individual ambition and collective survival. The story of pirate democracy is, ultimately, a story of people striving to create order, fairness, and cohesion in the most challenging of circumstances. As we near the final reflections, the enduring lessons of pirate democracy come into sharper focus. Despite the fleeting nature of the golden age of piracy, the Brotherhood demonstrated that human beings naturally seek fairness, accountability, and participation, even in the harshest conditions. Life aboard ship demanded cooperation, trust, and constant negotiation. Decisions about navigation, combat, and plunder were made collectively, and leadership was earned and maintained through demonstrated competence and fairness. Authority was never absolute. It was conditional, accountable, and temporary. The structure of pirate governance reveals a remarkable understanding of human nature. Crews were diverse, often including men of different nationalities, races, and social statuses, as well as women like Bonny and Maritime. Inclusion was practical, based on skill, trust, and loyalty. The articles codified expectations, ensuring that each member understood their rights and responsibilities. Disputes were resolved openly, shares were distributed transparently, and injuries were compensated. The system thrived because it aligned individual incentives with collective survival. Even in cultural memory, pirate democracy left a lasting impression. Literature, theater, and films romanticized adventure and rebellion, but underlying these stories were the principles of shared governance. Mutiny, negotiation, and collective decision-making, recurring themes in popular narratives, reflect the realities of the Brotherhood. Audiences are drawn not only to tales of action but to the subtle dynamics of trust, authority, and accountability that defined life aboard these ships. The collapse of pirate democracy under imperial pressure underscores both its fragility and its brilliance. Naval patrols, intelligence networks, and coordinated campaigns ultimately destroyed the system. Ships were captured, crews executed, and flags torn down. Yet the logic of the Brotherhood, the principles of fairness, consent, and shared responsibility, persisted in records, folklore, and maritime culture. Its lessons transcended time, influencing labor practices, cooperative governance, and the study of emergent social systems. Philosophically, pirate democracy challenges assumptions about power, morality, and social organization. Pirates were violent and self-interested, yet their governance ensured fairness, accountability, and cooperation. The system functioned not because of ideology but because it worked, because survival demanded it. Leadership was earned, compliance was incentivized, and collective decision-making ensured cohesion. The Brotherhood demonstrates that even marginalized or outlawed communities can create effective, ethical, and practical systems of organization. Modern scholars interpret pirate democracy as a case study in emergent governance and human adaptability. Where formal authority is absent or oppressive, people naturally develop rules, assign responsibility, and enforce accountability. The principles first practiced aboard pirate ships, transparency, consent, shared risk, and mutual trust, remain relevant in contemporary organizational structures, cooperative enterprises, and community governance. Pirate democracy is a testament to the resilience, creativity, and ingenuity of human social behavior. The story of the Brotherhood also serves as a reminder of the balance between freedom and responsibility. Pirate democracy was effective because authority was conditional and accountable, yet the system required adherence to agreed-upon norms. Individual ambition and collective interest were constantly negotiated, and survival depended on the careful management of both. This delicate balance offers enduring insight into leadership, cooperation, and human organization across contexts. As we approach the final reflections, it is clear that the legacy of pirate democracy is not simply historical, but deeply human. It shows that even in the most challenging circumstances, people can create order, fairness, and trust, that governance can emerge organically, and that cooperation is possible when authority serves the collective rather than itself. The Brotherhood's experiment, though temporary, leaves an enduring impression on history, culture, and our understanding of human potential. As we arrive at the final chapter of this journey through pirate democracy, it is time to reflect quietly on the legacy of the Brotherhood. Though the ships have long since vanished, the black flags lowered, and the crews scattered, the principles they lived by, fairness, consent, accountability, and collective responsibility, still echo across history. They remind us that even in the most chaotic and dangerous circumstances, humans have the capacity to organize, negotiate, and cooperate. The Brotherhood's story is one of ingenuity and resilience. Each voyage demanded constant judgment, skill, and negotiation. Captains were chosen by vote, leadership was conditional, and every member had a voice in decisions affecting their lives. Shares were distributed according to clear rules, injuries were compensated, and breaches of trust were punished. This fragile but functional system thrived under pressure, demonstrating that fairness and cooperation are not ideals, but practical necessities for survival. The cultural and philosophical ripples of pirate democracy extend far beyond the seas. Labor movements, cooperative organizations, and modern governance structures reflect echoes of these principles. The need for transparent authority, participatory decision-making, and equitable distribution of resources. Literature and film, even in their romanticized portrayals, preserve the tension between freedom and responsibility, individual ambition and collective welfare, central themes in the Brotherhood's governance. Yet, the story is also a meditation on impermanence. The golden age of piracy ended under the weight of empire. Ships were seized, leaders executed, and flags torn down. The Brotherhood could not withstand the combined force of organized naval power. But the lessons endure. Pirate democracy demonstrates that even temporary experiments in social organization can leave lasting impressions, shaping thought, culture, and collective memory long after the system itself has vanished. As you imagine the creaking timbers of those ships, the salty spray of the sea, and the quiet deliberations of a crew gathered around the articles, consider the human capacity for cooperation, fairness, and adaptability. Even in a world defined by danger and uncertainty, people found ways to balance self-interest with collective need, ambition with accountability. These are lessons that remain as relevant now as they were centuries ago. So take a deep breath. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the gentle rocking of the ship, the whispered debates among the crew, and the solemn votes that guided their journey. Let the calm of reflection settle over you, carrying the story of pirate democracy into your mind and memory. The Brotherhood may have sailed into history, but their principles, their humanity, and their experiment in fairness continue to float quietly through time, a testament to what people can achieve together, even in the harshest of circumstances. And now, let the story rest, letting the waves carry you gently, the echoes of the Brotherhood fading softly into history, leaving a sense of calm, reflection, and wonder.